What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another amazing Naruto story. What if Naruto returned after 7 years? If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments. And also check the description box to original creator of this beautiful creation. Modoroki Shrine, Nagi Island. The storm churned the heavens into a boiling sea of black and gray. Clouds swirled like angry leviathans, their roars reverberating as thunder cracked against the sky. Rain lashed the forest in relentless waves, hissing as it struck the earth and pooling in the uneven grooves of the stone path. Each drop seemed sharp, slicing through the air with a fury that matched the wind's howling assault. Lightning carved jagged scars of light across the darkness, illuminating the drenched canopy of trees for fleeting moments in bursts of silver light before leaving the world in shadow once more. Amid the chaos, the shrine stood, weathered but unwavering. Its foundation, stone slabs fitted together with such precision that even centuries of erosion hadn't broken their unity, sat slightly elevated, deflecting the worst of the rain. The wooden beams were dark with age, polished by time and tempests long past. Dragons adorned the structure, curling sinuously along the support posts, their carved scales gleaming faintly in the intermittent flashes of lightning. Their faces, fierce and majestic, seemed to peer out into the cutting wind as if daring it to do its worst. The roof, a layered curve of weathered tiles, creaked and groaned under the pounding rain but held firm, shedding water in streams that poured off the edges like miniature waterfalls. Beneath its sheltering eaves, the air felt charged, heavy with the raw energy of the squall. A faint smell of moss and cedar lingered, battling the sharp scent of ozone carried in from the storm. Naruto sat cross-legged on the worn wooden floor, his arms crossed and a frown etched deep into his face. He wore a dark tunic and pants that clung to him, soaked from their hurried escape into the shrine. Around his neck was a small orange scarf, its ends frayed but vibrant, a stubborn splash of warmth against the gloom. The boy's blonde hair, damp and spiked at odd angles, seemed to mirror his mood, restless, defiant, and unwilling to be tamed. His bright blue eyes darted around the shrine, taking in every detail. He didn't like to admit it, but there was something about the place that caught his attention, something that demanded it. The dragons, in particular, fascinated him. Their faces were frozen in expressions of power and calm authority, as if they had witnessed every storm and remained untouched. Naruto traced the grooves of their scales with his eyes, wondering how long it must have taken to carve such intricate patterns. The thought stirred a grudging respect for whoever had built this place, though he would never admit it aloud. But his awe quickly gave way to irritation. What's so great about a place that's falling apart? He muttered to himself, his gaze shifting to the moss creeping up the stone lanterns outside and the faded paint of the torii gate at the shrine's entrance. The relentless wind had loosened a tile on the roof, which clattered noisily against its neighbors. Naruto shifted uncomfortably, brushing water off his scarf and glancing at the small fire sputtering at his feet. It was pitiful, barely holding against the damp air, and its meager warmth felt like an insult against the storm's fury. His stomach growled, and he winced. The only thing worse than being stuck here was being stuck here hungry. Still, there was something strange about the shrine, something he couldn't quite put into words. It was as if the storm itself bent around it, raging against the trees and stones but leaving this patch of space untouched. The carvings of the dragons, the creak of the wood, even the hiss of the rain against the roof, everything felt alive, as though the shrine was more than just a building. Naruto's fingers tightened on his scarf as he gazed at the downpour beyond the shrine's shelter. Lightning flared, throwing the forest into stark relief. The trees bent and groaned under the wind's relentless assault, their leaves torn free and swirling like 1,000 frantic birds. He felt small watching it, not in the way that made him feel weak but in the way that made him feel aware. The world was big, too big. And here he was, a boy in a broken shrine, caught between fascination and frustration. He huffed, his breath fogging in the cool air, and turned his eyes back to the fire. "This is pathetic," he grumbled, poking at the damp wood with a stick. "How is this supposed to keep us warm? It's more smoke than fire." He threw the stick down with a sharp huff and crossed his arms. "And this shrine? It's barely holding together. We could have found something better if we'd kept going." From the shadows beyond the firelight, a low chuckle broke through the sound of the rain. Naruto's gaze snapped up, catching the faint outline of his master reclining casually on the wooden walkway outside the shrine's inner chamber. The man lay sprawled on his back, one arm tucked lazily behind his head and the other holding a sake bottle loosely by its neck. His silhouette, cast by the flickering firelight, danced across the beams above him, the play of shadows giving his figure a ghostly, almost otherworldly presence. "Better, huh?" his master drawled, his voice light and teasing. "Oh, little prince, sometimes the better thing isn't what you find. It's what you make." He tilted the sake bottle slightly, watching the drops of water streak down its sides as if they were racing. Naruto scowled at the nickname, a flicker of irritation flashing across his face. "I told you to stop calling me that," he muttered, his tone half-hearted. Little Prince. It wasn't the worst nickname he'd been given, but it was close. He knew exactly why his master used it, too. It was because Naruto was the last of his clan, and heir to a name that carried weight he didn't always feel like shouldering or even fully understood. But there was always a point to his master's nicknames, no matter how much they grated on his nerves. That was the annoying part. His master ignored the protest, instead shifting slightly to prop himself up on one elbow. His mismatched attire, a long, black, tattered cloak thrown over what looked like patched-together shinobi gear, gave him a haphazard, disheveled air. The bottle in his hand caught a glimmer of lightning from the storm outside, and for a moment, the shadows on his face deepened, making his grin look almost wolfish. "You're missing the charm of this place, Lightning Rod," he said, his tone almost sing-song, clearly reveling in Naruto's reaction to another new nickname. Naruto groaned audibly, throwing up his hands. "Now it's Lightning Rod? What does that even mean?" His master laughed, a warm, unhurried sound that somehow carried over the wind. Perhaps I may tell you," he said airily. "But since you're so hung up on complaining, let me tell you a story instead. Maybe it'll warm you better than that fire you keep glaring at." Naruto rolled his eyes but didn't interrupt, settling back slightly as his master continued. "This shrine," the man began, waving a hand toward the weathered wooden beams and carved dragons, "is older than you, me, or anyone in that village you were born in. Long before shinobi started flinging kunai and jutsu at each other, this place stood as a sanctuary. When samurai clashed, they laid down their swords at this threshold. When villages feuded, they sent their wounded here to heal. Even the gods themselves, if you believe the old tales, found this place neutral ground." Naruto's gaze shifted to the carvings of the dragons, their intricate details thrown into sharp contrast by the firelight. He tried to imagine the kinds of people who had sat where he was now: warriors, priests, outcasts, and fugitives. It was strange, thinking about how many stories the shrine must hold, all hidden beneath its worn surface. His master's voice softened slightly, though it still carried the undercurrent of amusement. "This place has seen shinobi like us, fleeing the aftermath of battle. Samurai seeking shelter from storms like this one. Refugees hiding from wars they had no part in. And even older things, little prince. Things that have no names but have passed through all the same." Naruto shivered, though he wasn't sure if it was from the storm or his master's words. He glanced toward the rain, which pounded relentlessly against the stone steps outside the shrine. "Why would they come here?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Because small things have a way of changing big things," his master replied, leaning his head back again. "This shrine may seem like just a collection of stones and wood to you, but it's been a haven for centuries. A single neutral point in a world that can't stop fighting." Naruto frowned, his brows knitting together. "That doesn't make sense. How can something so small make a difference?" His master grinned, tipping the sake bottle toward Naruto as if in a mock toast. That's where you're wrong. Big storms don't start with thunder, Lightning Rod. They start with whispers." He gestured toward the dragons carved into the beams. "Those began with a single chisel stroke. This storm? A flicker of air, a charge waiting to spark. And you." He reached out to tap Naruto lightly on the forehead, making the boy flinch and scowl. "You're no different." Naruto swatted his master's hand away, his irritation barely masking the flicker of curiosity in his eye. He leaned forward, propping his chin on his knees, the stick he'd discarded earlier now idly rolling under his fingertips. The rain pounded relentlessly outside, but his master's words stuck in his head like the faint echo of the thunder above. Big storms don't start with thunder, he thought, his brow furrowing. His master had a knack for saying things that sounded profound but felt just out of reach. Naruto hated that. Not knowing the answer was like an itch he couldn't scratch. Before he could stew further, his master's voice cut through his thoughts, smooth and lilting. And as a shrine is not just a shrine, he mused, the faintest smile curling at his lips, so too is a lightning rod not just a rod. Naruto blinked and looked up, catching the faint glint of his master's profile as he tipped his head back toward the wind. The rain sparkled as lightning briefly illuminated the scene, silver droplets cascading from the eaves to pool in the cracked stones below. A lightning rod, his master continued, his tone almost reverent, is a threat. It warns all who tread near of the danger it bears. He paused, turning the sake bottle lazily in his hand, his reflection faint in the polished glass. It's a promise, too, to guard against calamity, to draw the wrath of the skies so others might be spared. His voice softened, the words weaving between the drumbeats of thunder. And it is an invitation, a call to the gods themselves, daring them to strike. Naruto listened, a strange energy stirring in his chest as the words settled over him. The fire crackled weakly behind him, barely keeping pace with the tempest outside. He didn't quite understand the feelings swirling inside, pride, frustration, curiosity, but they were there, clashing like the storm overhead. Still, his annoyance with the weather, and his master's habit of burying lessons in riddles, won out. He sat up straighter, crossing his arms over his knees as he leveled a skeptical look at the older man. That's all nice and poetic, he grumbled, but it still doesn't make sense. Why even call me that? I don't even get how I've got a lightning chakra affinity, I can't even do the basic techniques right. His master turned toward him then, and his grin was sharp, a flicker of mischief crossing his face like the lightning above. As if conspiring with the heavens themselves, he let out a low laugh just as a deafening rumble of thunder rolled through the shrine. Before Naruto could process the sound, a brilliant flash of lightning tore through the sky, forcing him to blink against its blinding radiance. And when his eyes adjusted, his master was no longer lounging against the beams. Instead, he stood tall at the edge of the walkway, his silhouette framed against the backdrop of the storm. His arms were spread wide, as if to embrace the swirling chaos around him. You still think too narrowly, little prince, he called, his voice carrying effortlessly over the cacophony of wind and rain. The black clouds seemed to swell in response, the wind howling louder and the rain hammering against the roof with renewed fury. Thunder boomed again, shaking the very foundation of the shrine. Another fork of lightning split the sky, illuminating his figure in stark relief. The rod, his master said, his voice deep and resonant now, does not merely call forth the bolt. He turned slightly, casting a glance back at Naruto, his eyes glinting with a mixture of mischief and something deeper, something that made Naruto's chest tighten. Then, with a graceful flourish, he faced the tempest once more. His black cloak billowed behind him, the weather itself seeming to answer his presence. It begets the storm. 7 years later, Hokage Road High no Kuni. The road to the village hidden in the leaves wound lazily through the lush forests of the fire country, the midday sun filtering through the dense canopy above. Leaves rustled in the light breeze, and the faint hum of insects filled the air, adding a serene melody to the verdant surroundings. Naruto walked along the dirt road, his steps unhurried but deliberate, the long fringe of his sun-kissed hair swaying gently with his movement. His hair, tied loosely at the back with an ornate red string, was decorated with small glass beads, carved bone, and tiny silver bells that jingled softly with each step. He wore a dark haori splashed with faint orange spirals along the sleeves, reminiscent of the Uzumaki crest, over form-fitting shinobi gear that was practical yet elegant, evoking the image of a seasoned wanderer. Beside him walked a one-armed, white-haired teen, his demeanor subdued and reverent. The young Uzumaki's companion had striking crimson dots where his eyebrows should have been, with the pigmentation only emphasizing his solemn expression. His white hair was tied back neatly, and his plain yet sharp clothing hinted at a practical upbringing, one sleeve dancing freely below his elbow to the rhythm of his gait. Despite looking a few years his companion's senior, he carried himself with deference to Naruto, his posture slightly behind and to the side, as if he recognized his companion's authority without needing words. Naruto's cerulean eyes scanned the surrounding forest as they walked. The thick woodlands provided a natural fortress, brimming with resources that had sustained the Leaf Village for generations. The land itself seemed to exude prosperity, from the lush greenery to the fertile soil. This environment wasn't just a defense but an invaluable source of economic wealth. Merchants and nobles could visit Konoha without the hardships faced by other hidden villages, a fact that had shaped both its culture and its power. His thoughts wandered to the jagged peaks of Lightning Country, where the village hidden in the clouds perched atop impossible heights. The terrain there had dictated their militarized culture, the scarcity of resources shaping them into survivors and conquerors. He recalled the rumors that the Lightning Daimyo despised the Fire Daimyo, the jewel of Konoha's accessibility fostering a quiet resentment. It was easy to understand why. The Land of Fire's wealth flowed like a river to its hidden village, while other lands had to scrape by through harsher means. He drifted further still to the deserts of Kase no Kuni, so stark and barren compared to the Fire Country's abundance. The grand obelisk, he mused, could never have inspired the same devotion here. There was a kind of rugged endurance in the people of the desert-locked country, a trait born of their harsh surroundings. The Leaf Village, and the larger Fire Country itself, possesses a relative comfort that offered no such crucible, yet it had cultivated its own form of strength. Still, even here, vigilance had its place. Naruto's sharp senses picked out sentries concealed in the shadows of trees, their presence subtle but unmistakable. Guard posts became more frequent as they neared the village gates, and he could feel the faint hum of a fuinjutsu barrier wrapping around the area like an invisible shroud. It was a delicate weave, a silent watcher that marked every step they took. An unseen pair of eyes, he thought, his lips curving into a faint, unreadable smile. But his thoughts turned dark for a moment. Even a village as hidden and well guarded as Waterfall had fallen, he reminded himself. No amount of defenses, no abundance of resources, could make a place invincible. Lord Naruto, Kimimara's soft, respectful voice broke the silence. We're approaching the village. Naruto glanced at him, his faraway thoughts dissipating. He smiled slightly, his tone warm but tinged with gratitude. Thanks, Kimimaro. I was starting to drift. Kimimaro nodded, his sharp moss-eyed gaze steady but deferential. It is only natural for one such as you to consider the weight of things. Naruto chuckled softly, a sound that carried both amusement and a hint of self-awareness. Before he could respond, however, the air shifted. Shadows melted from the trees, and in an instant, they were surrounded. The Anbu operatives stood as silent sentinels, their uniform black and gray armor blending seamlessly with the forest shadows. Their masks, carved with intricate precision, each bore the likeness of a different animal, lending an air of both fascination and intimidation. A tiger's fierce stripes slashed across one mask, its sharp teeth etched into a permanent snarl. A hawk's sleek visage adorned another, its angular design evoking a predator's focus. To the right, a boar's rugged features were unmistakable, its tusks exaggerated to menacing proportions. And closest to Naruto, a fox mask, its eyes narrow and calculating, seemed to watch him with unsettling intensity. The ANBU's stillness was unnerving, their presence almost blending with the natural backdrop. They were a perfect balance of man and shadow, each one a symbol of the Leaf's silent enforcers. Naruto's gaze swept over them, his expression calm but tinged with wry amusement. His voice broke the tense silence. Well, he said, his tone steady but light. It's nice to see the Leaf's hospitality hasn't changed. The Anbu captain, identifiable by the slight crimson insignia on his shoulder plate and the hawk mask he wore, stepped forward. His voice was deep and commanding. Uzumaki Naruto, the captain said, the council requests your presence. Naruto raised a brow, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Anbu do not make requests, he thought, though he didn't voice it. Instead, he gave a faint shrug, the bells in his hair jingling softly with the motion. The streets of the Hidden Leaf buzzed with an energy that was almost overwhelming. Everywhere Naruto looked, there was motion, a market stall bursting with produce, shinobi leaping effortlessly between rooftops, children weaving through the crowd like darting fish. Civilians stepped aside for the Anbu escort, their glances betraying a mixture of curiosity and deference. Yet, the sight of the masked elite was hardly out of place. In a village where the military and civilian lives intertwined so deeply, such displays of authority were as common as the shadows cast by the watchtowers. Even the civilians carrying tools instead of kunai moved with a sense of purpose that betrayed their familiarity with discipline and order. Kimimaro's soft voice broke through the hum of activity. "It's too bright here," he murmured, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sunlight glinting off the wet cobblestones and the clamorous swirl of voices. "And too loud." Naruto chuckled, the sound low and knowing. "And so," he replied, his voice carrying a note of mischief, a whisper became a storm. Kimimaro's pale brow furrowed in quiet thought, but he didn't reply, instead following closely as Naruto set a measured pace toward the looming Hokage tower in the distance. A younger Anbu operative, his voice sharp with impatience, finally broke the tense silence. "Uzumaki Naruto," he said, his tone clipped, "you've delayed long enough. The council will not take kindly to this. First, you kept them waiting in the land of low tide. And now," he gestured at their unhurried progress through the crowded streets, "you test their patience even further." Naruto glanced back at him, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Ah," he said smoothly, "but that depends on what standard you measure the delay." The operative stiffened. "The standard of urgency," he replied tersely. "The council doesn't summon someone lightly." Naruto tilted his head thoughtfully. "Do they?" he mused. "I wonder what they truly know about me. Do they even know if I am not some wandering civilian? For all their supposed intelligence, I'd wager the council isn't privy to anything the Toad Sage's network produces that is deemed fit for the Hokage's ears alone, of which any information of my person undoubtedly is categorized. I could very well be an untrained vagrant. Or perhaps," he paused, a glimmer of mischief in his eyes, "for all they know, I could have broken my leg along the way, delaying my return. Or I could have found a damsel in need of rescue, or even a downtrodden nation to liberate." The young Anbu bristled. "And did any of those things happen?" Naruto's grin widened, his tone teasing. "Of course not. I'm surprised the Anbu program fosters such an active imagination." Several of the other masked operatives chuckled softly, their amusement unmistakable even through their masks. The captain gave a low, approving laugh, but, as evidenced by his low growl and taut posture, the younger operative apparently was scowling, clearly unamused. Naruto turned his attention to Kimimaro, whose seafoam green eyes roved over the bustling streets. "Kimimaro," he asked, "what do you know of the ANBU's history?" "Only that they are more dangerous than most," Kimimaro replied evenly. "Beyond that, I know little." Naruto nodded, his gaze flicking briefly to the disgruntled Anbu. "The ANBU's roots stretch back further than the village itself," he began. "Before the Hidden Leaf, there was chaos, the clan wars era. Among the clans, there were small, talented groups who couldn't match the bloodline limits or economic might of the larger clans. But they focused on the pure essence of being shinobi: deception, subterfuge, fear. They hid their faces behind animal masks, a tradition that marked their unity while still nodding to their clan identities." His tone grew more reflective. "These clans became known as the Shadows. What they lacked in brute strength, they made up for with cunning and precision. When the first Hokage formed the Hidden Leaf, he struggled to contain them. Hashirama-sama envisioned a kinder future, a united one. But the Shadows? They clung to the old ways, seeing themselves as guardians of what they believed was the shinobi's true nature." Naruto gestured vaguely toward the rooftops, his voice dropping as if sharing a secret. "They were an unwieldy beast, effective but unruly. Often, their missions bled into self-directed ventures, pursuing what they deemed best for Konoha, regardless of orders. It wasn't until the second Hokage that they were reined in. The young ANBU's posture somehow became more alert at that, taut with a perceived offense." Kimimaro tilted his head slightly, intrigued, as the other Anbu merely kept at the relaxed pace. "What did the second Hokage do?" "Tobirama-sama was a man of precision," Naruto explained. "Where his brother sought unity, Tobirama sought control. He reshaped the Anbu, stripping them of their individuality and old loyalties. They became faceless, formless. No longer clans, but a single unit beholden solely to the Hokage. Uniformity was their new creed, and their masks became their only identities. The old ways were buried under Tobirama-sama's doctrine. Although Naruto's cadence had not yet changed, and the young ANBU's still posture had not deflated, the other Anbu started to stiffen, their shoulders raising with their animal depictions as if to raise their hackles. He paused, his voice taking on a faintly sardonic edge. But even with leashes, the Anbu remained what they were at their core: shadows. The third Hokage, though kinder than Tobirama-sama, saw no reason to change them. The leash remains, and with it, their orders are absolute. No deviation, no embellishment. Naruto's gaze shifted to the younger operative wearing the Inishishi mask, and his tone grew briefly stern. The sudden change startled the young man, if the sudden jolt to his shoulders were to be understood. "Tell me, Inishishi-san, are you one of those beasts of old, unfettered from the law of your orders?" The younger Anbu hesitated, his voice faltering. I am not." Naruto's expression softened, a glint of humor returning to his eyes. "Good," he said lightly, his tone turning teasing. "Because if you were, I'd have to ask you to put those fangs to use. Or at least learn to use them properly." He winked, cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. The captain let out another short laugh. "A fine history lesson," he said, his tone amused. "Not often taught these days. And it makes one thing clear: if the council didn't specify a time frame for your return, Uzumaki, then we've no grounds to enforce one now." Naruto's smile deepened. "Exactly," he said lightly. "See? Even shadows can appreciate nuance." The council chambers of the Leaf Village were an architectural reflection of the village itself, a blend of old and new. The domed ceiling bore the marks of an earlier era, with wooden beams intricately carved in patterns that told the story of the village's founding. The walls were adorned with newer fixtures, chakra-powered sconces that cast an even, artificial glow across the room. The chamber's floor was tiered, designed to signify hierarchy, with the higher tiers reserved for the noble shinobi clans and the lower tiers for the civilian representatives and lesser officials. At the center stood a circular table with enough gravitas to match the weight of the decisions made there. Naruto's eyes swept the room as he entered, his gaze drifting from one occupant to the next. The full council was present, as expected. The shinobi representatives dominated the upper tiers, the Hyuga, Nara, and Kurama clans, with the empty seat of the Uchiha clan a silent reminder of its tragic absence. Clan heads from the lower ranks, like Sume Inuzuka and Shibi Aburame, sat a tier below, their expressions ranging from bored to mildly curious. The operational leaders of the village were present too: the Anbu commander, the Jonin commander, the chief physician, and others who oversaw the village's day-to-day military operations. The lowest tier held the civilian council, wine merchants, landholders, and others whose wealth afforded them influence in the village's affairs. Naruto couldn't help the wry smile tugging at his lips as he considered their presence. A village born of war, beholden to merchants and farmers. It's absurd. Why should the Lord of Fire's hidden blade answer to a grain merchant? Then again, his eyes flicked to the lively streets he'd walked through earlier. Calling this ostentatious, sprawling city a hidden blade is probably stretching it. Naruto's entered the chamber, his steps unhurried. He caught a few surprised glances from those who hadn't seen him in years. He'd left the village a scrawny, wide-eyed child. Now he stood before them taller, stronger, and exuding a confidence that was hard to ignore. Shibi Aburame adjusted his glasses, his quiet voice barely audible over the murmurs. "Time has certainly refined him." "Refined?" Sume Inuzuka muttered, her lips curling into a grin. "More like sharpened. That kid always had a bite." 7 years gone, Shikaku Nara mused, his sharp eyes narrowing as he studied the blonde teen. And yet he strolls in here as though he never left. How troublesome. Naruto's lips quirked as he caught snippets of their murmurs. He paused at the center of the room, casting a long glance at the council members before raising a hand in a mock salute. "Good to see everyone again. I hope you didn't miss me too much. It's been, what, 7 years? I'm sure you all kept busy without me." The civilian council members bristled at his casual tone, while the shinobi representatives exchanged faintly amused looks. The Anbu captain stepped forward. "Council members," he announced formally, "Naruto Uzumaki has appeared, as ordered." A civilian council member, a balding man in fine robes, stood abruptly, clearly unimpressed. "And not a moment too soon," he said sharply, his voice laced with irritation. "This delay is unacceptable. A summons from this council is not to be taken lightly, boy." Naruto tilted his head, his expression one of exaggerated confusion. "Boy? What? 7 years and I'm still boy?" At this rate, I'll be kid when I'm 50. He let the sarcasm linger before continuing, his voice lilting with mock curiosity. But tell me, am I being summoned for some heinous crime? If so, I'd love to hear the charges. Just imagine the scandal. The man's face reddened, but Naruto didn't give him a chance to retort. Wait, don't tell me. I stole someone's lunch, didn't I? Or maybe it's treason because I didn't write. You know, postal services are surprisingly unreliable when you're traveling. A ripple of amusement passed through some of the shinobi present, though they quickly masked it. Naruto continued, voice carrying a lilt of mockery, though his expression remained composed. I am, after all, merely a citizen of the Fire Nation, not a shinobi. Whatever authority over the third Hokage's weapons you may believe to be yours to wield does not extend to one of the Fire Lord's citizens. His smile deepened, its sharp edges cutting across the chamber. Unless, of course, you're here to levy a criminal charge against me? The man's face reddened, but before he could reply, Danzo Shimura spoke from his position among the village elders. You have been a ninja since birth, Uzumaki, he said, his gravelly voice cutting through the room. By precedent and long-standing decree, you are the property and responsibility of this village. Naruto's expression didn't falter, but his thoughts sharpened. Shimura Danzo, a danger above the rest. Not that a room filled with war-breathing shinobi could ever be called harmless, but him? He's the shadow you fear even in the dark. Naruto turned his attention to Danzo, his grin sharpening even further. Property, you say? That's a bold claim, even for you, Shimura-sama. But I'm afraid you'll have to cite something stronger than vague decrees. You see, during my absence, or should I call it my sabbatical, I had plenty of time to brush up on a few things. Like the Bill of Rights of Hai no Kuni. He gestured lazily toward the Civilian Council. And the Charter of Civilian Rights. Fascinating documents, really. Did you know that even the Great Hidden Leaf, as the fifth arm of the Fire Lord's military, is subject to those laws? No citizen can be compelled to answer a summons like this without cause. High crimes and misdemeanors, yes. But a random meeting for what I can only assume is your entertainment. That's a gray area at best. Danzo's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. Naruto, sensing the reaction, pressed on, his voice taking on a mockingly thoughtful tone. So, unless this is the prelude to a criminal charge, which, honestly, I'd find hilarious, I'm left wondering by what authority you've summoned me here. You're not accusing me of something, are you? The silence in the room grew heavier, broken only by the soft creak of a chair as someone shifted. Danzo leaned forward slightly, his gaze cold and calculating. You misunderstand the nature of. The chamber doors swung open with a deep creak, cutting Danzo off. All heads turned as the third Hokage entered, his robes immaculate, his presence commanding. The room stood in unison, a gesture of respect that even Danzo didn't dare forego. Sarutobi Hiruzen raised a hand, signaling for them to sit. Danzo is correct, the Hokage began, his voice calm but firm, that Naruto Uzumaki is a unique case. While he may lack a shinobi license, there are circumstances that obligate him to adhere to certain precedents. Danzo's posture shifted slightly, a smug glint in his eye that Naruto didn't miss. But Sarutobi wasn't finished. However, he continued, his tone hardening, those same precedents make one thing abundantly clear. Individuals of Naruto's classification fall under the sole purview of the Lord of Fire and his chosen representative, the Hokage. This council has no authority to summon him or question his actions without my express consent. Danzo's expression darkened, his subtle victory immediately snatched away. The civilian council erupted into murmurs of protest, but Sarutobi silenced them with a sharp glance. Furthermore, he said, his gaze sweeping the room, I will be investigating how the civilian council became aware of Naruto's arrival in the first place. Until then, this meeting is adjourned for the civilian council. You may disperse. The civilian representatives hesitated, their outrage evident, but they dared not defy the Hokage. One by one, they filed out, leaving the shinobi representatives and the elders behind. Naruto leaned back slightly, his expression inscrutable but inwardly amused. Well played, old man. Sarutobi turned his attention to Naruto. Now, let us discuss the matter for which you were truly summoned. The chamber was still alive with tension as Naruto stood before the assembled shinobi council. The room, dimly lit by artificial lanterns, was filled with an array of faces, stern, curious, and cautious. At the head of the room sat the third Hokage, Hiruzen Sarutobi, his gaze warm yet commanding. Naruto noted how the old man's robes of office seemed heavier than they should, the weight of years and leadership etched into his posture. Naruto's lips curled into a whimsical smile, though his eyes betrayed none of the mirth. "Quite the gathering for little ol' me," he quipped, his voice light as air. "What's the occasion? Surely not just a welcome home party." Hiruzen regarded him silently for a moment, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his lips. "It is good to see you again, Naruto," he said, his tone carefully measured. "But I must ask, what were you doing all the way out in low-tide country?" Naruto's expression didn't falter. He gave a languid shrug. "Just out for a wander before the noose grew too tight." The words were light, almost flippant, but they hung in the air with a weight that was hard to ignore. Some of the council members exchanged glances, their unease palpable. Hiruzen's eyes narrowed slightly, but he let the comment pass. "You've been gone a long time," he said. "The village could use your skills. I would like you to rejoin our shinobi forces." Naruto's whimsical facade cracked for the briefest moment. His gaze sharpened, and his smile grew thinner. "Who's asking?" The question hung in the air, a challenge and a trap all at once. Hiruzen's expression shifted, not anger, but a flicker of understanding. He leaned back in his seat, his fingers steepled before him. The council members looked to him expectantly, but he didn't speak right away. Finally, he answered, his voice steady. "The Hokage is asking of you." Naruto tilted his head, his whimsical grin returning as if it had never left. "Ah, I see. Well then, Hokage-sama, I'll consider it." The underlying tension in the room tightened like a drawn bowstring. Hiyashi Hyuga, his pale eyes cold and calculating, spoke up. "And what of the Kagaya survivor you brought with you? Why is such an individual here?" Naruto's smile didn't waver. "Picked up a few strays along the way," he said smoothly. "I suppose I've always had a soft spot for the lost and wayward." Hiyashi's frown deepened, but before he could press further, Shikaku Nara's voice cut through the tension, lazy but sharp. "Naruto, have you even been taught to utilize chakra properly? Have you received any formal shinobi training?" Hiruzen answered before Naruto could. "He is Uzumaki," the Hokage said, his tone carrying the weight of certainty. "His blood would demand of him that it be used. And his journey has provided him a unique education that no formal academy could match." Naruto's gaze flicked to Hiruzen, his expression unreadable. "High praise. Thank you, Hokage-sama." There was a trace of sarcasm in his tone, but it was hard to tell if it was intentional. Hiruzen's gaze softened ever so slightly. "Naruto, the village is not the same as it was when you left." "It can't be. But it remains your home." Naruto's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet contemplation. For a moment, the whimsical mask slipped entirely, and the weight of his years away, the betrayals and lessons learned, seemed to press upon him. Then, just as quickly, the mask was back. "Home, huh?" he said, his tone light again. "I suppose that's something to think about." The council watched him, their expressions ranging from wary to curious. Hiruzen's gaze lingered on him, filled with a mix of hope and something unspoken. Whatever it was, Naruto didn't seem ready to acknowledge it, not yet. The streets of Konoha were alive with the hum of daily life. The air was thick with the aroma of street food and the distant clang of blacksmiths' hammers. Naruto strolled through the village, his hands tucked into his tattered cloak, the faintest smirk playing on his lips. The village he had left behind was both familiar and alien, a tapestry of old memories woven with threads of change. Children's laughter echoed down the narrow alleyways as academy students were picked up by their parents. Naruto paused to watch a small group of children in their oversized headbands, each bursting with excitement as they recounted their day. A pang of something he couldn't name tightened in his chest. He shook it off, his smirk widening as one child tripped over their own enthusiasm and landed face first in the dirt. "Some things never change," Naruto muttered to himself. Beside him, Kimimaro walked silently, his pale skin and stoic demeanor drawing occasional curious glances. His crimson-lined cloak shifted slightly as he moved, the bone blade at his side a silent testament to his origins. "It's a lively village," Kimimaro said, his voice low and even. Naruto glanced at him, his smirk softening. "It's earned that right. Konoha has been on the winning side of history more often than not." That's how you get streets like this: happy kids, busy merchants, and a whole lot of noise. Kimimaro's gaze swept over the bustling marketplace. Victory has its price. The quiet ones in the shadows pay it. Naruto's grin turned sharper. Oh, don't worry. Konoha's got shadows deep enough for anyone who's paid that price. They walked on, the streets growing narrower and more labyrinthine as they ventured deeper into the village. Vendors hawked their wares with practiced enthusiasm, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony. Naruto's sharp eyes picked out the exotic goods on display. Spices from Suna, intricate textiles from Tetsu no Kuni, and even a gleaming set of kunai engraved with symbols he recognized as originating from the distant land of sky. Konoha has always had a taste for the foreign, Naruto said, gesturing to a stall selling lacquered masks from the land of demons. Brings a little bit of the big world to our cozy corner. Kimimaro inclined his head. And yet, the world remains distant. This village feels insular. Naruto's smirk faltered for a moment before returning. You're not wrong. Konoha is good at putting on a show, but it's still a fortress at heart. Keeps the bad guys out and the good little shinobi in. As they passed through a quieter street, a sudden commotion drew their attention. A runaway cart barreled down the slope, its wooden wheels rattling violently as it careened toward a young boy chasing after a ball. The boy's mother screamed, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife. Naruto was a blur of motion. In an instant, he was there, scooping the boy up and leaping clear of the cart just as it crashed into a nearby stall, sending produce flying in all directions. Setting the boy down, Naruto crouched to meet his wide-eyed gaze. Hey, kid, maybe stick to playing away from the death traps, yeah? Naruto said, ruffling the boy's hair. The mother rushed over, relief flooding her face as she hugged her son tightly. She turned to Naruto, her gratitude evident. Thank you so much? Her voice trailed off as recognition dawned. Her expression shifted to one of uncertainty, her hands tightening on her child's shoulders. Naruto's smile didn't waver. No thanks needed, just keep an eye on him, okay? The woman nodded quickly, muttering another thanks before leading her son away. Kimimaro watched the exchange silently, his expression unreadable. Old habits die hard, Naruto said lightly as they resumed their walk. As they left the bustling marketplace, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the village. Naruto paused at a quiet intersection, his gaze thoughtful. Inashishi-san, he called, his voice carrying a note of amusement. A moment later, a young Anbu with a boar mask appeared, his movements precise but tinged with nervous energy. You called, Uzumaki-sama? Naruto's grin returned. Been tailing me since the council meeting, haven't you? What do you think? Am I gonna run? The Anbu hesitated. I was ordered to. Relax, Naruto interrupted, waving a hand. Just tell me. Are my quarters ready? The Anbu straightened. Yes. The Uzumaki compound has been made available for your use. He paused before adding, thank you, for the history lesson earlier. My senpai were grateful. It's not something we've been taught since the fourth's passing. Naruto's expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable passing over his face. The fourth Hokage, huh? The butcher of Iwa. He shook his head slightly. Everything I've read says he was soft-spoken. Kind. Men like that. He trailed off, his smirk returning. They're the most dangerous of all. The Anbu tilted his head slightly. He was also called the king of the low places. Naruto's brow furrowed. I don't think I've heard of that one. Before the younger Anbu could respond, a second figure appeared. The captain from the council chamber emerged from the shadows, his presence commanding. Namikaze Taicho understood the old ways, he said. He was the first Kage to have come from the corp. Naruto raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. The captain gestured for him to follow. Come, I'll take you to your clan home. As they walked, Naruto's thoughts swirled, the weight of the day settling over him. The village, his past, and the looming shadows of the future all pressed in, but he kept his head high, his grin sharp. The maze of Konoha was vast, but Naruto had always thrived in places where others lost their way. As they neared the Uzumaki compound, the change in atmosphere was palpable. The streets grew quieter, the sounds of the bustling village giving way to an eerie stillness. The compound itself was sprawling, surrounded by high walls that bore the faint traces of the Uzumaki crest. Though it had been maintained, the air of abandonment was hard to miss. For a fleeting moment, the worn gateway of the Uzumaki compound resembled the rust-colored arch of a shrine torii. Despite the clear night sky, Naruto thought he could smell the crack of ozone in the air. The sensation was fleeting but vivid, the kind of moment his master had once described as a spark, a tiny force that could kindle something far greater if nurtured. His hand hovered near the gate before he finally pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest like an old shrine door that had seen better days. Inside, the grounds were overgrown, weeds creeping along the stone pathways. The main building loomed ahead, its windows reflecting the fading light of the day. The smell of damp earth and decay clung to the air, yet Naruto found himself oddly anchored, as if this derelict place was a lightning rod, drawing him back to something elemental and inescapable. "Well," Naruto said, his voice breaking the silence, "home sweet home." Kimimaro surveyed the area with a critical eye. "It's defensible. The walls are strong, and the layout is strategic." Naruto snorted. "Good to know in case we get invaded." Again, they stepped inside the main building, the air thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. Naruto ran a hand along the wall, his fingers tracing the grooves in the wood. Memories, faint and fragmented, stirred in the back of his mind. His master's words surfaced unbidden: "The small things beget the great." A single groove in the wood guides the storm's force, a lone rod grounds the lightning. He pulled his hand back as if the wall had shocked him. "You lived here?" Kimimaro asked. "For a little while," Naruto replied. "Before everything went to hell." He turned to the Anbu captain, who had followed them inside. "What's the story with this place? Why keep it standing if nobody's using it?" The captain hesitated before answering. It was considered a matter of respect. The Uzumaki were instrumental in Konoha's founding. Destroying their legacy would have been dishonorable. Naruto raised an eyebrow. "Respect, huh? Funny way of showing it, leaving it to rot." The captain inclined his head. "The council thought it best to preserve it as it was. A monument to the past." Naruto shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. "Monuments don't mean much to the dead." He turned away, his gaze falling on a faded tapestry hanging on the wall. The Uzumaki spiral was prominently displayed, surrounded by intricate patterns. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the fabric. For a moment, the spiral seemed to move, like ripples spreading from a single drop in still water. A thread linking him to a history he barely knew, and yet, it felt as though a storm could be born from its quiet center. Kimimaro broke the silence. "You intend to stay here?" "For now," Naruto said, letting his hand drop. "Might as well make use of it. No sense letting all this space go to waste." Unknown. The room was chaos masquerading as opulence. Once, it must have been breathtaking, a masterpiece of craftsmanship and wealth. Shattered vases lay among scattered piles of silk cushions, their embroidered gold patterns rendered meaningless by claw-like rips. The remains of a lacquered table slumped against the wall, its intricate inlay of precious stones reduced to scattered fragments. Priceless tapestries hung in tatters, swaying faintly in a draft that carried the acrid scent of candle wax and blood. Hundreds of candles were strewn across the room, some knocked over and dripping wax onto the ruined floor, their flickering flames casting restless shadows. In the center of it all, a lone figure lounged on a throne-like chair, a relic untouched amidst the destruction. The man was draped in shadows that danced across his form, but one detail refused to be obscured: his crimson hair, glowing like embers against the gloom. His houri matched, its vivid color irradiated in the dim light, so stark it seemed to bleed into the air around him. One arm rested on the throne's armrest, while the other held something aloft, a severed head. He twirled it absently, his amber eyes half-lidded, as though lost in thought. The headband of hidden waterfall still clung to the forehead of the lifeless face, its metal surface smeared with dried blood. The silence was broken by the sudden appearance of a kneeling figure, who materialized as if conjured by the shadows themselves. The man knelt low, his forehead nearly touching the floor, his loose kimono parting to reveal a tapestry of tattoos that seemed alive under the candlelight. Oni masks leered from his shoulders, a dragon coiled down one arm, its eyes glinting with unholy light, while a nine-tailed fox curled menacingly across his chest. The figures shifted with each subtle movement, as though straining against the confines of his skin. His clenched fist rested against the ground, the kanji for one inked starkly on the back of his hand. He remained silent, waiting. The man on the throne finally lowered the severed head, tilting it as if considering its expression. Then, with a lazy wave of his hand, he signaled for his servant to speak. "My lord," the kneeling figure began, his voice measured and reverent. "Reports from the elemental nations are as follows. The samurai armies of the Land of Iron march on the borders of the Land of Hot Water. Territorial disputes continue between the Wind and Earth daimyo, escalating near the neutral zones. The Land of Snow has officially declared the tyrant Doto Kazuhana as its daimyo. And the newly formed Kirigakure continues its aggressive political agenda to claim the sea routes near the Land of Waves." The crimson-haired man remained silent, his expression unreadable, as though the world's conflicts were no more than distant whispers. The kneeling man hesitated for a moment before continuing. "There is one more matter. Orochimaru of the White Snake has approached us, requesting an alliance." A flicker of amusement crossed the man's lips. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. He twisted his body, draping himself languidly across the throne's armrests. With an almost careless flick of his wrist, he tossed the severed head toward the kneeling man, the macabre object rolling to a stop before him. The servant raised his head slightly, his lavender hair catching the candlelight, his amber eyes lifting deferentially. The necklace of a circle containing an upside-down triangle dangled from his neck, glinting faintly. "My lord?" The man in crimson opened his eyes briefly, his tone dismissive yet laced with quiet command. "Do what you wish of these matters. Kill who you think is required, subvert whatever is necessary." He paused, turning his head slightly to meet the servant's gaze. "But kill the Sannin. His arrogance galls me," he sighed, closing his eyes again, as though the effort of giving instructions had wearied him. "None of the rest is of interest to me." The servant lingered a moment longer, his gaze unwavering. Rising gracefully, he turned to leave, but paused mid-step. "The boy has returned to the Leaf Village." The crimson-haired man shifted slightly, as though to dismiss the matter outright, but his servant's words made him pause. His voice dropped to a grim monotone. "He interests me even less. That black-cloaked bastard made sure of that." With that, the crimson-haired man reclined further into the throne, his focus drifting away, leaving only the oppressive silence of the ruined room to swallow the faint flicker of the candles. End of Chapter 1. There it is. Very excited about this. I would appreciate any feedback or criticism, especially a comment with any theories people might have. I have always appreciated in the great author Nihon Zanjetsu's works that they include a section at the end of their chapters teasing future scenes, and have included a similar styled teaser below. Naruto stood in the center of the Shinobi Council chamber, his wrists bound in chakra-suppressing cuffs that glinted dully under the cold light of the room. His hair, no longer neatly kept, cascaded in wild spikes, framing a face hardened by defiance. Though bound, his presence loomed large, his piercing gaze locking with the assembled elders. At the head of the room, Tsunade Senju stood tall in her Hokage robes, the iconic hat perched on her head. Her expression was a mix of exasperation and concern, lines of fatigue etched into her features. Danzo, seated with an air of cold detachment, watched Naruto with the calculating gaze of a predator. "Then I will go myself," Naruto declared, his voice sharp enough to cut through the murmurs that rippled through the council. Several members exchanged uneasy glances. Danzo's single visible eye narrowed. "Foolishness," he muttered under his breath, but his words carried weight in the tense atmosphere. Tsunade slammed her hand down on the table, the sound reverberating like a gavel. "Damn it, Naruto, what you're asking for is impossible." The room fell into a stifling silence. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, pressing down on everyone present. Even the most hardened shinobi shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Naruto lowered his head, his hair obscuring his eyes as a low, unsettling laugh escaped him. It was a sound that sent a chill through the chamber. Slowly, he raised his head, and his fiery blue eyes met Tsunade's. "I didn't think you would be so foolish, Senju-sama," he said, his voice soft yet laced with an edge that made even seasoned council members falter. Danzo stiffened, his face betraying a rare flicker of alarm. "What did you do, Tsunade?" he demanded, his tone accusatory but tinged with genuine concern. Naruto stepped forward, the chains on his cuffs clinking faintly. "To challenge the impossible of an Uzumaki," he continued, his voice gaining strength. The room seemed to hold its breath, an unfamiliar tension crackling in the air. Then, like a storm breaking, a thick, jagged bolt of black energy descended upon Naruto, as if the heavens themselves had been called to bear witness. The council chamber shook with the force, the air heavy with the scent of ozone and power. When the light faded, Naruto had disappeared, his cuffs shattered on the floor and his defiance unmistakable. The council could only sit in the still silence that had been left in wake of the bolt, held captive by the storm that had erupted before them. Then, all at once, instincts were roped around their hesitation and strangled the last vestiges of awe, and the shinobi jolted into action. "Find Naruto Uzumaki at once and bring him back," Tsunade ordered to the surrounding shinobi. "If he gets away, he will single-handedly invite the Fourth Shinobi War to Konoha's door." Mountain country. The stark white trees of the massive forest stretched endlessly in every direction, their bleached trunks glowing faintly under the dim light filtering through the canopy. Naruto crouched on a thick branch high above the ground, every muscle taut and trembling with exhaustion. His breath was shallow and controlled, but each inhale burned in his chest. The stillness around him was oppressive, the silence broken only by the distant rustle of leaves, a sound he couldn't tell was natural or engineered by his master. He clenched his fists. 4 hours, he thought bitterly, scanning the labyrinth of ghostly trees. The exercise had begun innocently enough, or so he believed. They'd been sparring, his punches clumsy and ineffective against his master's relentless critiques. Then, with a sudden kick that had sent Naruto hurtling across the clearing, his master had snarled, "You don't even know how to throw a punch, boy. We're playing hide and seek." Naruto had instantly known he was in for it. His master wasn't just skilled, he was impossibly devious. And now, after stepping on dozens of explosive seals, getting doused in honey bombs, narrowly dodging swinging logs, and almost falling prey to paralysis matrices and pit traps, Naruto felt like he'd been run ragged. But worse than the exhaustion was the creeping dread that had slithered into his chest an hour ago. It gripped him now, icy fingers tightening around his heart. He couldn't explain it, he wasn't in danger of dying. His master might be brutal, but Naruto trusted him not to kill him outright. And yet, what if these traps aren't his? The thought struck him like a kunai to the gut. He tried to shake it off, but his mind spiraled. How could he have set up so many in such a short time? What if someone else got here first? What if someone's incapacitated him or killed him? His breath hitched, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out his thoughts. What if he's already dead? The dread surged, his lungs heaving in shallow bursts, his vision swimming. Then, through the noise of his racing mind, a single thought cut through like a blade. Him? Caught in someone else's trap? That'll be the day. Naruto forced himself to stillness. His hands, trembling moments before, slapped the sides of his thighs and he plastered on a grin. "Okay," he muttered to himself. "Get it together. You're Uzumaki Naruto. You don't lose at stupid games." His eyes scanned his surroundings. That was when he spotted it, a faint glint on a branch a few meters away. Ink, just barely visible against the stark white bark. An explosive note. Naruto's grin widened. He allowed himself a moment to breathe, to feel the confidence he was projecting, and then he leapt. He didn't dodge this time. No fancy tricks, no attempts to divert the yield. He aimed himself directly at the branch, closing his eyes as he neared the explosive tag. If this is how it ends, at least I'm going out with a bang. But instead of an explosion, he felt a sudden yank. His flight was abruptly cut short, and he landed hard on his back, the air rushing from his lungs. Towering above him was his master, his pitch-black coat blending seamlessly into the surrounding shadows, his crimson eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You ruined the game," his master said, his voice a gruff rumble. "You weren't supposed to figure it out until it got dark." Naruto, still catching his breath, grinned cheekily up at him. "Found you," he said with a grin, his voice triumphant despite his exhaustion. For a moment, his master just stared at him, his stern expression unwavering. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a low, soft chuckle that sent a shiver through Naruto. "It appears that you did, noisy shadow," he said, his tone strangely warm. Naruto beamed up at him, the lingering dread in his chest dissolving into nothingness. Naruto groaned, brushing himself off as he sat up. His master stood over him, a faint grin tugging at the corner of his lips. Well? His master asked, his voice calm yet expectant. How did you figure it out? Naruto blinked, then shrugged nonchalantly. Figure it out? Was there a point to all this? I just figured if I got knocked unconscious, even you couldn't make me keep running around this stupid forest. The grin on his master's face twitched wider for a moment before fading into his usual calm expression. Jumping right at the danger to solve the problem rarely works as well as it may have today, he said quietly. Naruto felt a pang of unease at the sudden shift in his master's tone. Before he could reply, the atmosphere darkened. His master's presence changed, becoming colder, heavier, oppressive. And you didn't even learn the lesson. His black eyes seemed to consume the light, their emptiness an abyss that threatened to swallow Naruto whole. The feeling that had gripped Naruto during the exercise rushed back with a vengeance, clawing at his chest. His breathing hitched. He swallowed hard and managed to stammer, "So, that was you, this whole time?" As suddenly as it came, the oppressive aura vanished, replaced by his master's widening grin. "Oh, child," he said, his tone lilting and whimsical. "You flatter me. Were I truly in hiding, you wouldn't have even seen that explosive tag." Naruto's shoulders sagged with relief, though he was still wary. His master's moods were as unpredictable as the traps littering the forest. His master crouched down, his black coat folding around him like shadows pooling on the ground. His voice grew softer, taking on the rhythm of a storyteller. "A shadow is not quiet, nor unmoving," he began. "A shadow is unassuming. To silently stalk someone, you cannot cast too large a presence, they would notice you at a glance. Yet you cannot force too small a whisper, for even the dullest mind senses the unnatural." Naruto furrowed his brow, trying to keep up with the riddle. "No, a shadow is a reassuring tree." Swaying slightly in the wind, his master continued. "A shadow is a falling leaf, its movements seemingly erratic but always purposeful. When you master your presence, you can wander unaided, invisible." Naruto stared at him, the words stirring something deep inside him. "And when you master that?" His master's black eyes locked onto Naruto's, and for a brief moment, the oppressive dread returned, a wave of cold washing over him. "Your will may take the form of any weapon you deem necessary." The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Naruto felt his heart pounding, his body tense yet still. He wanted to laugh, to brush off the intensity, but something about the way his master said it made him stay silent. His master straightened, his grin back in place. "For now, noisy shadow," he said, his tone light again, "I suggest you take that wisdom and find your footing before the next game begins." Naruto gulped and nodded, already dreading what the next game might entail. Present time. Root base number 5. Konoha. The room was steeped in darkness, lit only by a dim lantern hung from the low ceiling. The glow caught on the edges of a bloodied blade lying between the kneeling operative and his master, Shimura Danzo. The blade was impossibly straight and cold, its crimson-streaked steel reflecting the faint flicker of light. Danzo's one visible eye bore into the masked figure kneeling before him, who continued his report with the measured cadence of a soldier. "It has been a week since the snake Sanin was last sighted following the attack," the operative stated, his voice calm but tinged with the gravity of his words. "The methods of communication with Orochimaru normally at our disposal remain incooperative. Efforts to re-establish contact have yielded nothing." Danzo remained silent, his fingers tapping against the arm of his chair. His gaze briefly flickered to the bloody blade on the floor before he gave his next order. "Send more troops," he commanded, his voice like the grind of steel. "Focus on his known laboratories. If the snake is dead, plunder everything of value: records, samples, experiments. No detail is too small." As the words left his mouth, a dozen of the silent, masked figures behind the reporting operative melted into the shadows, disappearing to execute his will. The room fell quiet once more, save for the faint hiss of the lantern's flame. Danzo leaned back, his eye narrowing in thought. "It's as if he was swallowed whole," he muttered to himself, the weight of the blade seeming to bear down on the room. Orochimaru was cunning, too cunning to have been caught unawares. The devastation reported from his last known fortress surpassed even the madness of the snake. Brutality without cause, precision without purpose. It wasn't just Orochimaru's death, it was the deliberate annihilation of everything connected to him. Danzo's thoughts turned. Could it have been one of the Fire Lord's samurai generals? He dismissed the notion almost as quickly as it had come. Hitohito-sama had no history of action against Orochimaru, and the samurai lore lacked the flair for the grotesque excess the reports described. Another village, perhaps? But none had both the opportunity nor the inclination. The salamander loyalists in AIM were too scattered and ragtag, and no other village had the resources or motive for such a calculated strike. His eye narrowed further, the shadow across his face deepening. A thought crossed his mind, too dark to ignore. Could it be one of the Tenna? He murmured. His hand gripped the armrest of his chair tightly before he shook his head slightly. If it were one of them, their reach would have been unmistakable. Yet the possibility lingered. Snapping himself from his reverie, Danzo turned his attention back to the operative. The Jinchuriki, he said abruptly. What of him? The masked figure straightened. He has kept mostly to the outskirts of Training Ground 42, training with his Kagaya companion. In the marketplace, he has been observed haggling with foreign merchants. His only consistent points of contact in the village are a ramen stall in the northwestern district and Kenzo Hamura, the staff chunin assigned to guard the Hokage's secretary. Danzo raised a brow. Kenzo Hamura? The operative nodded. It appears they share a passion for ramen. They bonded over a consumption competition. Danzo scoffed, the sound sharp and dismissive. Fools find their kin in fools. He waved a hand. The boy presents no reason to deviate from our current plans. His gaze flicked to the bloodied Kusanagi blade lying between them, a relic of Orochimaru's legacy now sullied with mystery. Danzo's mind turned back to the larger picture, calculating his next steps. He would not let chaos unravel the delicate order he sought to preserve. Send word to the agents in Frost Country and Snow Country, he ordered coldly. Their missions have been completed acceptably. I want them reassigned immediately. They are to investigate any rumors or sightings of the Red Emperor. The masked operative bowed deeply and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Danzo alone with the dim light, the bloody blade, and his growing unease. Hanami Square, Konohagakure. The sun hung bright and warm over the bustling streets of Konoha, its golden rays illuminating the cheerful face of Kenzo Hamura as he bounded along the cobbled paths. He was a young man of wiry build, his leaf headband tilted slightly on his messy brown hair, and a slice of toast clamped between his teeth as he hurried through the village. Despite his obvious rush, there was a buoyancy to his steps that spoke of his good mood. He waved to a shopkeeper setting out goods and even saluted a passing patrol of chunin, his words muffled around his breakfast. Morning, Kenzo-kun, called an elderly granny perched outside her home, a polished red apple in hand. Kenzo skidded to a halt, reluctantly pulling the toast from his mouth. Good morning, Granny Tsubaki. She extended the apple to him. Here, take this. You're looking a bit skinny, gotta keep your strength up. He laughed, scratching the back of his head. Thank you, but I'm already running late. Maybe tomorrow. Before she could insist, he bowed slightly and darted off again, toast in hand. Not 5 steps later, the florist's daughter, Harumi, caught his eye as she arranged bouquets outside the family shop. She leaned on the flower cart with a knowing grin. Hey, Kenzo, what's the gossip from the tower today? Kenzo held up a hand in mock defeat as he jogged backward. Sorry, Harumi, no time. Late. She huffed but smiled, shaking her head as he disappeared into the crowd. Kenzo reached the Hokage's tower in record time, practically skidding to a stop as he pushed through the entrance. Inside, the hustle and bustle of the administrative hub greeted him, and he waved energetically to every familiar face he saw. Morning, Akio-san. Hey, Kenzo. Late again? Ah, you know me. Busy. Reaching the secretary's desk, Kenzo straightened his uniform and plastered on his brightest grin. The secretary, an older woman with steel gray hair tied in a neat bun, glanced up from her paperwork. Her stern expression softened slightly at the sight of him. Morning, Hamura, she said, her tone crisp but not unkind. Did you pick up the daily packet from the records office? Kenzo froze, his grin faltering. The packet? She raised an eyebrow. Oh, about that, he said, scratching his head nervously. I thought it'd be better organized if I gave them a few extra minutes. Be right back. Before she could respond, Kenzo was already backing out of the room, giving a hasty wave before disappearing down the hall. The secretary chuckled softly, shaking her head as she turned to the other Chunin guard stationed nearby, a burly man named Daiki. That boy, Daiki said, smirking. He's a total goof. The secretary smiled faintly. I think he's sweet. Apparently, he made a new friend last week during lunch. Ever since, he's been helping me finish my work early so he can get an extra hour to challenge his friend. Daiki raised an eyebrow. So that's why we've been getting off an hour early. I thought the Hokage was feeling generous. Nonsense, the secretary said with a wave of her hand. If the administrative bureau had more work for us, we'd be here through the night. It's just been quiet the last few days. Before Daiki could respond, Kenzo burst back into the room, his arms laden with a bulging packet of documents. Village executive correspondence, zoning requests, bank notes confirming payments, public and foreign requests, shinobi stipend increases. Everything that required the designation of the Hokage's secretary for the day was shuffled into one looming stack. He staggered to the desk, slamming the stack down with an exaggerated groan. Do you know how long it's going to take to get through all of this? He asked, mock despair in his voice. The secretary glanced at the packet and raised an unimpressed eyebrow. You don't have to do any of it, Hamura. Your job is simply to stand in the corner and stare at an old woman all day. Kenzo laughed, the tension melting from his shoulders. Maybe so, but two sets of hands work faster, right? The secretary's lips twitched into a smile. All right, then, but don't expect any sympathy when you regret volunteering. Never do. Kenzo replied cheerfully, already flipping through the top pages. His energy was infectious, even in the quiet monotony of the office. Training Ground 43, Konoha. The morning sun cast its glow over the dense forest, the branches of the massive trees swaying gently in the breeze. Two Anbu captains crouched on a high branch, their white masks gleaming faintly in the light. Below them, the clearing was alive with the clash of bone and flesh. Naruto stood with his eyes closed, beads of sweat tracing lines down his face as he twisted and shifted, narrowly avoiding or redirecting the relentless assault of Kimimaro. The Kaguya's bone weapons lashed out in a flurry of stabs and slashes, each blow as precise as it was vicious. Yet, Naruto never struck back, his movements an intricate dance of balance and evasion. One of the Anbu tilted her head, her cat-shaped mask reflecting the moonlight. He's remarkable, isn't he? I haven't seen recruits this inspired by someone in years. Even the younger ones are talking about him, saying he embodies the creed of the Anbu. The other captain, whose mask bore the shape of a bird, snorted softly. It's strange how inspiration comes. Though I doubt they'd feel the same if they knew he wasn't one of us. Still, Kat continued, he's got something. The kind of fire that gets under your skin. Even old Inu Senpai would probably be impressed. Bird chuckled. You think so? He's busy with his own broths now, isn't he? True, Kat conceded. Thought he might be glad to know the Hokage handed his team a C-rank mission to Wave Country, but that ended up being a day before the boy arrived here, so his vacation may end up working against him. They both fell silent for a moment, watching as Naruto fluidly dodged another slash and used his forearm to redirect a bone blade away from his torso. Any updates on his training? Bird asked. Kat shifted slightly, folding her arms. He hasn't been doing much of anything unusual. Wakes up early, comes here to spar with Kimimaro until the evening, then goes to that ramen stand in the northwestern district. Spends hours there eating noodles with that Chunin, Hamura. It's almost disturbing how much they both consume. Bird's head tilted in amusement. What's he been working on? Mostly taijutsu and ninjutsu, Kat replied. Though, I have to admit, some of the exercises I've seen should be adopted by the Corps. Really? Kat nodded. The kid put level 7 resistance seals on before the sparring session. Bird let out a low whistle. Impressive. Kat was quiet for a beat, her mask angled downward toward the clearing. But there's something off about him. Oh? Bird's tone carried mild curiosity. He seems to struggle with interacting with the villagers, Kat said. Doesn't talk to anyone but Hamura. No contact with other shinobi. And the third is getting nervous. Naruto's been delaying their scheduled discussion for days now. Nervous? Bird echoed, turning to face his comrade fully. Kat hesitated, then sighed. Our standing orders are to watch and report if there's any indication of escalation. But there's been nothing. The kid sticks to a strict routine: spar, eat, sleep. Bird nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on Naruto below. And yet something feels off, Kat admitted, her voice lower. It's like he's waiting for something. Or hiding something. Before he could continue, a third Anbu landed silently on the branch behind them. His mask, shaped like a hawk, glinted sharply in the moonlight, commanding immediate attention. Do not deviate from the strict law of your orders, Hawk said coldly, his voice like a blade through the still air. The two captains stiffened and nodded in unison. Kat hesitated for a moment before lowering her head. Understood, sir. Hawk's gaze lingered on Naruto below, his tone firm. We were not tasked with questioning the boy's behavior. We observe. Nothing more. Yes, sir, Bird and Cat replied in unison, though an undercurrent of unease lingered in their silence as they turned their attention back to the clearing. Below, Naruto spun away from another strike, his movements growing sharper despite the fatigue etched on his face. The sound of bone clashing against redirected strikes filled the air, a testament to his resolve. Hokage Tower. Konoha. The soft glow of the crystal ball illuminated the Hokage's office, casting flickering shadows over the aged wood and rows of bookshelves. Hiruzen Sarutobi leaned forward, his weathered hands resting on his desk, his sharp eyes fixed on the orb. Within its surface, the image of Naruto Uzumaki sparring with Kimimaro came to life, the boy twisting and contorting to avoid bone blades with his eyes tightly shut. Hiruzen's lips curled in a small, proud smile, though his brow furrowed with the weight of hidden sadness. The boy's resilience and ingenuity were undeniable, yet the Hokage couldn't shake the pangs of guilt that surfaced whenever he watched. His breath hitched when Kimimaro appeared to impale Naruto with a bone spear, but he exhaled with relief when the boy's body shimmered and was replaced by a log, revealing a perfectly timed Kawarimi. You could summon him, you know, came a calm, gruff voice from the shadows near the window. Hiruzen didn't look away from the crystal ball. Summon him for what? He asked, his voice measured. To talk, the voice replied, closer now. Hiruzen sighed, his gaze lingering on Naruto, who had managed to sidestep Kimimaro's latest strike. The boy already bears so many weights. Pressures have a way of extinguishing the will of fire before it has a chance to burn brightly. A figure stepped forward into the light of the office. Broad-shouldered and clad in the standard shinobi uniform, the man crossed his arms. His face was partially obscured in shadow, though his beard caught a glint of the crystal's glow. Hiruzen continued, his tone quiet but resolute. Naruto is not just an ordinary boy. He has obligations as a son of the Uzumaki clan, though few acknowledge it. He lives under the ever-looming presence of Danzo, whose ambitions have never strayed far from him. There are those who hate him for his heritage, who see him as a symbol of something they cannot forgive. And then, the Hokage's voice trailed off, his words heavy with unspoken meaning. After a moment, Hiruzen drew in a slow breath. He carries a burden no child should bear. I won't push him, not now. The boy is clever, strong. He will tear down mountains and split seas in time. But for now, I will let him find his own way. The man by the window let out a low hum, a hint of skepticism in his tone. Are you sure this isn't just your weak heart talking? Hiruzen chuckled dryly, rubbing his temple. Perhaps it is. I am old, after all. Too old, maybe. Call it the folly of an aging man who fancies himself the grandfather of the village. He leaned back in his chair, his smile softening. Is it so wrong to want to welcome home one of my grandchildren? The other man snorted, stepping fully into the light. It was Asuma Sarutobi, his sharp features bearing a mix of amusement and affection. Well, as someone who actually is your child, I can say with authority that your old heart is definitely soft. Hiruzen scoffed, feigning outrage. You should watch that tobacco habit of yours before you cast aspersions on anyone else's health. Asuma's expression deadpanned, and he pointed at the Hokage's hand. Says the man who is literally packing his pipe as we speak. Hiruzen glanced down at his hands, which had indeed been preparing his pipe with practiced ease. He chuckled, setting the pipe aside with a resigned shake of his head. Touché, my boy, touché. Asuma smirked, leaning against the edge of the desk. So, what are you going to do about the kid? Hiruzen's gaze returned to the crystal ball. For now, nothing. I'll watch. And when the time is right, I'll be here for him. That is what a Hokage does, isn't it? Later that evening, Hokage Tower. The Hokage's tower was quiet as the late evening set in, the usual hustle of the day replaced with the steady hum of work being finished. Kenzo Hamura sat at his desk, papers spread around him like the battlefield of a diligent soldier. Across the room, the Hokage's secretary, Miss Hanaka, worked through her own stack of documents with practiced efficiency. Her glasses rested low on her nose, and her lips pressed into a determined line. A soft knock on the door interrupted the stillness. An Anbu operative entered, masked and silent as ever. Without a word, they handed a sealed packet to Miss Hanaka. "The Hokage has gone home for the night," the Anbu said, their tone clipped. "Chunin patrols are now stationed in the tower. Security is fully covered." With that, the Anbu disappeared as quickly as they had come. Miss Hanaka stretched, the pops of her joints echoing lightly in the room. "Well, Kenzo," she said, glancing at him over her glasses, "you're officially off duty. You don't have to stay any longer, Chunin patrols have got the security detail handled." Hamura looked up from his work, his pen pausing mid-scratch. "And leave you here to finish all this by yourself?" He gestured to the mountain of paperwork. "That doesn't sit right with me." She waved him off with a knowing smile. "I've been doing this job long before you were assigned here, and I'll be doing it long after you're gone. Go on, get out of here. Go to that ramen stand of yours and meet your friend. I'm sure you've earned a little fun." Hamura leaned back in his chair, feigning deep contemplation. No, I don't think so." His grin was quick and genuine as he leaned forward again. "How could I enjoy the night knowing you're stuck here under this mountain? I'll stick around and help." Miss Hanaka rolled her eyes, but the warmth in her expression softened the gesture. "Suit yourself, stubborn boy. But don't think I won't tease you about this tomorrow." Hamura chuckled and returned to the stack in front of him, diving into the mundane grind of village administration. He sorted requisition forms, trade permits, and council memos, assigning them to their respective departments or to the Hokage's desk for approval. One scroll detailed requests for an increased mission budget, while another outlined diplomatic correspondence with the Land of Waterfalls. Time slipped by, marked only by the secretary's occasional yawns and the rustle of papers. Eventually, Miss Hanaka dozed off, her head resting on her folded arms at her desk. Hamura allowed himself a small smile, glancing at her with quiet admiration before returning to his work. It was then that he found it, a plain, folded letter addressed to the old monkey. He raised an eyebrow. "Creative," he muttered, unfolding the letter. Inside was a rambling poem with lines reading, "When the old monkey climbs too high, his grip begins to fail. Best to sit beneath the tree, and let others tell the tale." Hamura tilted his head, bemused. What in the world? But as he examined the page, he noticed faint indentations on the paper. His brow furrowed, and he brushed his fingers lightly over the surface. Channeling a thin layer of water over his fingertip, he swiped it across the page. The water highlighted faint kanji, nay, root. Himura's grin sharpened, his cheerful demeanor slipping for a moment. "Old men and their codes," he murmured, shaking his head. He began tracing patterns over the page, searching for the hidden message. After several failed attempts, inspiration struck when his gaze fell on the spiral of the Leaf Village symbol on his headband. He traced the writing on the page in a spiral, and letters began to align, forming two words, "White Snake and 10, no." Himura's grin widened, breaking into something almost feral. "Found you," he whispered, his voice low and triumphant. Pulling out a blank scroll, he laid it over the letter and channeled a sharp burst of chakra, transferring the message into the scroll for safekeeping. Sliding the original letter back into its folder, he carefully placed it in the stack marked for the Hokage. Resuming his usual cheerful demeanor, he approached the sleeping secretary and gently shook her shoulder. "Miss Hanaka," he said softly, "you should head home. We'll tackle the rest of this tomorrow morning." She blinked awake, rubbing her eyes. "You're too kind, Kenzo." "All right, I'll leave it in your hands." He helped her gather her things, walking her to the tower's exit before returning briefly to lock up. Once satisfied, he finally headed home. Hamura entered his modest apartment, a quiet space that reflected little of the village's boisterous life. He moved to his bedroom, flipping on the light. There, standing in the center of the room, was himself. An exact duplicate of Kenzo Hamura stood motionless, sealed in a stasis-like state. Intricate seals covered his body, radiating from a small slip of paper affixed to his sternum. Himura's grin returned, sharp and calculating. He moved toward the figure, tracing a finger lightly over the seals, his mind worrying with thoughts of the encoded message and its implications. Time to see how tonight's little discovery plays out, he murmured, his voice tinged with something far less cheerful than his usual demeanor. Then, his form shimmered. Smoke enveloped him in an instant, dissipating to reveal Naruto Uzumaki standing in the same spot, his trademark grin firmly in place. He tugged on his overcoat and dusted off his pants, as if shedding the guise of Kenzo Hamura was just another part of his day. "I guess it's time to meet with the Hokage," he said, his tone light but carrying an undercurrent of resolve. With that, Naruto turned and left the room, the grin never leaving his face. The air was crisp and heavy with the scent of salt, the cries of seabirds echoing faintly over the rugged cliffs of Tetsu no Kuni's northernmost point. Below the rocky outcrop, Tyson Bay stretched endlessly, its churning waters gleaming like liquid silver under the overcast sky. The bay's waves struck the jagged coast in a rhythm as relentless as the presence of the man sitting across from Naruto and his cloaked master. Jinsei was an immovable force, his posture stiff and upright as if carved from stone. His weathered face was lined with years of discipline, the kind born from an unyielding commitment to an ideal. At his side rested a plain straw hat and a wooden sword, the latter an oddity that carried an aura of menace despite its humble appearance. Naruto sat quietly, legs crossed on the bench and arms folded as he leaned back, watching the exchange with faint curiosity. His master, by contrast, lounged with practiced ease, the edge of his black cloak fluttering in the breeze as he spun a cup of tea lazily in his hands. "Jinsei-san, you wound me," Naruto's master said, his voice a rich blend of mock offense and amusement. "Here I thought we were old friends, and yet you refuse to extend a single hand when I come bearing only honest intentions." "Honest intentions?" Jinsei's voice was a deep monotone, his eyes unwavering as they bore into the man opposite him. "Do not insult me, Kyoru. I have known you long enough to recognize your honesty as a veneer for whatever scheme you are currently spinning." Kyoru's grin widened, his teeth flashing in the dim light. "Scheme is such an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as an opportunity. A chance for you to contribute to something truly remarkable." Jinsei didn't respond immediately, his face impassive. He lifted his tea, taking a deliberate sip before setting it down with a measured precision that suggested he weighed every movement as if it carried the weight of a sword stroke. "Your flowery words do little to disguise your intent," Jinsei finally said. "And I have no interest in entangling myself in your remarkable pursuits. My purpose is to guard against folly, not participate in it." Naruto's lips twitched upward at that, a quiet snort escaping before he could stop himself. He quickly masked it by pretending to cough into his hand, though the faintest quirk of Jinsei's eyebrow told him he hadn't been subtle enough. "See?" Kyoru said, gesturing toward Naruto as if the boy had somehow validated his point. "Even my young apprentice finds your rigid demeanor amusing. Perhaps you should consider relaxing a little, Jinsei-san. A touch of humor wouldn't kill you." "I fail to see the humor in wasting time," Jinsei retorted, his tone as sharp as any blade. "And your apprentice would do well to learn patience instead of mirroring your flippancy." Naruto bristled slightly but held his tongue, though his master caught the shift in his demeanor and gave him a sidelong glance, the faintest nod of approval. "Patience, my dear Jinsei, is a luxury afforded to those with time to squander," Kyoru said, setting his cup down with a theatrical sigh. "But let us not waste any more of yours. I'll speak plainly, the boy is special. He has the potential to shape the world in ways you and I cannot even fathom. And for that, I need your help." Jinsei's gaze flicked briefly to Naruto, as cold and assessing as the icy winds blowing in from the bay. Naruto straightened instinctively under the scrutiny, his resolve hardening. "He is untempered steel," Jinsei said at last, looking back at Kyoru. "And steel bends or shatters depending on the hand that shapes it. You would ask me to contribute my craft, yet you remain the one holding the hammer. Why should I trust you?" Kyoru leaned forward, his playful air dropping slightly as he met Jinsei's gaze. "Because I am not the only one holding the hammer. The boy is shaping himself with every step he takes. I am simply ensuring he has the tools to strike true." The tension between the two men was palpable, a silent battle of wills that hung heavy in the air. Naruto shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping lightly against the table as he resisted the urge to speak. His master sipped his tea without concern, his eyes glinting with that peculiar mix of amusement and calculation Naruto had come to associate with trouble. The rhythmic tapping of Naruto's fingers against the rough wood of the table broke the silence that had settled after Jinsei's curt words. "I know what you're asking, Kyoru," Jinsei said, his tone sharper now, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You wrap your requests in fine metaphors, but I see the forge you're leading me to. I will not grant you the favor." Jinsei stood, his movements crisp and deliberate, as though the weight of his decision had already been made before the conversation began. "If that is all, I will take my leave. There are better ways to spend my time than listening to you weave riddles." "Wait," Kyoru's voice cut through the air like steel. Jinsei froze mid-step, his back still turned. Slowly, with the grace of a predator acknowledging arrival, his hand moved to the wooden sword at his side. The gesture, though subtle, was filled with restrained menace. When he turned, the cold edge of his gaze swept the table, and Naruto felt a sudden chill prickle the back of his neck. It was the same feeling he got when Yuru Shisho was teaching him about presence. That inexplicable weight in the air that made it hard to breathe. He couldn't help but shift uncomfortably, his fingers halting their tapping. His master, unfazed, offered Naruto a conspiratorial wink. "Jinsei-san, before you walk away, let me ask, have you been encountering any troublesome events of late?" Jinsei's brow furrowed, though he made no reply. "I've heard whispers," his master continued, the voice carrying the lightness of idle gossip but the edge of a blade, about a certain bandit clan. "Seems they've declared war on the Steel Saint." A grumble escaped Jinsei's lips, low and rumbling like distant thunder. "Impish gnats following the scent of my horse. I'll deal with them in due time." "Ah, but time is such a fleeting thing," Kyoru said, leaning back in his chair. "What if I told you I could save you the trouble of chasing shadows? I know where their horde is gathering." Jinsei's gaze remained locked on him, calculating. After a long moment, he let out a slow exhale. "And what would you want in return for such information?" Kyoru smiled, the kind of smile that made Naruto simultaneously admire and fear his master's craftiness. "Only that you grant the favor I asked for earlier." There was a tense pause before Jinsei, begrudgingly, gave a sharp nod. "Speak." Naruto's master gestured lazily toward the white-capped waves of Tyson Bay. "Out there." Jinsei blinked, his brows knitting together in confusion. "What nonsense is this?" "Someone," Kyoru said, twirling his teacup for emphasis, "sent them a letter. Said they were staying at this very inn. The letter may or may not have included a string of childish insults about their families. I imagine their boat is the one anchored just beyond the rocks there." Jinsei's expression darkened. "You meddling fool," he growled, his hand tightening around the wooden sword. Naruto watched with wide eyes as Jinsei's frustration reached a boiling point. In a single fluid motion, he drew the wooden blade and took a step forward. "Is he really going to hit you with that?" Naruto muttered, glancing nervously at his master. But Jinsei did not strike. Instead, he shifted into a perfect stance, gripping the wooden sword with both hands. With an elegance that belied its simplicity, he brought the blade down in a single, immaculate slash. The world seemed to pause. Naruto blinked, his heart pounding as a stillness blanketed the air. And then, like the finger of a god splitting the heavens, the very fabric of reality seemed to rupture. A crack tore through the air, invisible yet undeniable, as if the world itself had been sundered by Jinsei's strike. The earth at the edge of the rocky beach parted violently, a jagged scar cutting through stone and sand alike. The sea beyond the bay groaned as the force ripped through it, the ocean floor revealed in its wake like a wound torn open. Naruto's mouth hung open as the destructive force reached the distant boat anchored in the bay. The vessel split cleanly in two, as though sliced by an invisible blade, and crashed onto the exposed seabed. The sea seemed to hold its breath for a moment before surging back with a vengeance, swallowing the wreckage and dragging it into the depths. Naruto sat frozen, his brain struggling to process what he had just witnessed. That was with a wooden sword," he mumbled, more to himself than anyone else. Jinsei turned sharply, glaring at his master with a mixture of annoyance and resignation. "This," he said, gesturing to the bay, "is why I do not get involved in your schemes." The trickster merely chuckled, raising his teacup in mock salute. "And yet, here you are, Jinsei-san. What a marvel you are. Naruto watched the interaction with newfound awe, a single thought echoing in his mind. I want to learn how to do that. As the echoes of the ocean's roar subsided, Jinsei sheathed his wooden sword with a practiced ease, turning his back on the table. Without another word, he began to walk away, his steps crunching against the rocky ground. I'll need a week to set things in order, Jinsei called over his shoulder, his tone curt. Don't make me regret this, Yurei. Naruto's master raised his teacup in response, though Jinsei didn't turn to see it. As the swordsman disappeared down the path, Naruto tilted his head, still staring at the empty spot where the man had stood. Yuru Shisho? Who was that guy? Naruto asked, still marveling at the aftermath of Jinsei's demonstration. Kyoru smirked, swirling the dregs of his tea lazily. Some call him the best in the world at swinging that stick around. Naruto blinked, his brow furrowing as he tried to reconcile the man's wooden weapon with the devastation it had caused. The best? But he doesn't even use a real sword. Kyoru shrugged, his tone teasing. Real enough to you, wasn't it, lightning rod? Naruto opened his mouth to protest but stopped himself, his mind turning back to the display he had just witnessed. He tapped a finger against his chin, the way he did when he was thinking hard. Finally, he looked up at his master. What was I supposed to learn from that? Kyoru leaned back in his chair, studying Naruto with a glint of amusement in his eyes. What do you think? Naruto frowned, mulling it over. Always be prepared? Kyoru's laugh boomed out, warm and rich. He reached over to ruffle Naruto's messy hair, ignoring the boy's protests. Half right, my little lightning rod. Half right. Naruto scowled, smoothing his hair back down. So what's the whole answer then? Instead of replying directly, Kyoru leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Let me tell you a story, he said, his voice dropping into the cadence he used for his riddles and lessons. There was a woman from the land of wolves, he began, his eyes distant, as though watching the tale unfold. She was clever, sharp as the northern winds. But she lived in a village constantly raided by rival clans, and no amount of preparation seemed to stop them. No walls high enough, no traps clever enough. The enemy always found a way. Naruto leaned forward, drawn into the story despite himself. One day, she decided to stop defending and start shaping. She sent messengers to her enemies with false promises of weakness, baited them to fight where she chose. She turned their greed and impatience against them, leading them into ravines, into frozen bogs, into battles she had already won before they began. She didn't just prepare, Naruto, she shaped the battle before the first arrow flew. And by doing so, she won the war. Naruto sat back, his brow furrowed as he mulled over the lesson. So, to be prepared is to have already won the battle, but to shape the battle is to win the war? Kyoru smiled at his student, his expression one of quiet pride. Now you're thinking, but you'll need to chew on it longer before you get the full taste. Naruto frowned, still puzzling over the riddle, before his eyes widened with a spark of realization. Wait, were you the one who sent the bandits after Jinsei? Kyoru's grin widened, his hand reaching out to pat Naruto's head again. Now you're getting it, lightning rod. Naruto groaned, brushing his master's hand away. You're impossible. And you're learning, Kyoru said with a wink, pouring himself another cup of tea as the waves of Tyson Bay shimmered in the distance. Uzumaki clan compound, Konoha. The Uzumaki compound was an example of both grandeur and decay. Encircled by thick stone walls etched with ancient seals, the sprawling estate sat as a forgotten remnant of a once proud clan. Overgrown vines climbed the red and white walls of the main house, their roots weaving into cracks and crevices like nature's reclamation. The grounds, though vast, were wild, grass grew unchecked, and sakura trees stood gnarled with time, their blossoms scattered like faint memories on the uneven cobblestone paths. The compound felt timeless, steeped in an air of both reverence and abandonment. Inside the main house, Naruto shuffled into the modest kitchen, dragging his feet with a weariness that went beyond his usual morning reluctance. He rubbed at his eyes, suppressing a yawn. The discipline he maintained demanded he rise with the sun, but today was different. Last night had been consumed by a tedious flood of paperwork, courtesy of his charade as Hamura. Even Naruto's boundless energy had its limits, and staying up all night to keep up appearances had pushed him closer to them than he liked to admit. He slumped into a chair, head resting on one hand as he waited for the faint promise of caffeine or sustenance to breathe life back into him. The soft sound of footsteps approached, deliberate and even, accompanied by the faint clink of porcelain. A moment later, Kimimaro stepped into view, carrying a tray with freshly brewed tea and a small plate of neatly arranged rice balls. Despite having only one arm, his movements were precise, his balance and grace almost unnaturally flawless. The way he handled the tray spoke of countless hours of practice, as though he had long since mastered turning a limitation into art. "Good morning, Naruto-sama," Kimimaro said, setting the tray down before him. His voice was even, but there was a quiet reverence to the way he spoke, as though addressing a revered lord. Naruto cracked one eye open, glancing at the steaming cup of tea. "Kimimaro, I've told you 100 times, just Naruto is fine." Kimimaro straightened, his expression unchanging. "And I have told you 100 times, that would be inappropriate for one of my position." Naruto groaned, slouching further into the chair. "Your position? You're not my butler, you know. You don't have to do all this." Kimimaro's pale green eyes sharpened slightly, his voice taking on an edge of indignation. "It is my duty and honor to serve you. Anything less would be an affront to your station, Naruto-sama." Naruto smiled, exasperated, leaning back in his chair as he picked up the tea. "My station? What, as the poor schmuck who has to juggle running around the village and doing paperwork in secret?" He took a sip, the warmth soothing his exhaustion. "I think you're overestimating me, Kimimaro." Kimimaro's face remained as stoic as ever. "I do not overestimate you. It is you who underestimates yourself. You are destined for greatness. It is my duty to ensure you reach it unimpeded." Naruto chuckled, shaking his head. "You really need to lighten up, you know that?" He leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. "What would you even do if I told you to take a day off? Relax for once?" Kimimaro's eyes narrowed slightly, his expression unflinching. "I would disregard such an order. Ensuring your well-being is paramount. Any lapse in my vigilance would be unacceptable." Naruto sighed, a mix of amusement and exhaustion coloring his tone. "You're impossible, you know that? Like, full-on brick wall impossible." Kimimaro inclined his head slightly, the faintest shadow of pride flickering across his otherwise stoic features. "If that is your assessment, Naruto-sama, then I am fulfilling my role admirably." Shaking his head, Naruto bit into one of the rice balls, savoring the simple but satisfying flavor. "You're lucky you make good tea," he mumbled between bites. Kimimaro stood silently, watching with the calm vigilance of a sentinel. His pale features remained impassive, but there was an almost imperceptible softening to his gaze as he observed Naruto. Naruto leaned back in his chair, pointing the half-eaten rice ball at Kimimaro. "You know, if you keep this up, you're gonna spoil me. I'll turn into some pampered noble who can't lift a finger for himself." Kimimaro arched a pale brow. "That is unlikely. Your discipline and self-reliance are unparalleled. However, should that ever occur, it would simply mean I am performing my duties to perfection." Naruto burst out laughing, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're something else, Kimimaro." Kimimaro's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly, as though the ghost of a smile threatened to break through. "And you, Naruto-sama, are the center of my purpose." Naruto groaned theatrically, rubbing his temple. "You're killing me with this devotion, you know that?" Kimimaro inclined his head slightly, his expression as unreadable as ever. "If it is what you require, I would do so gladly." Naruto stared at him for a long moment before sighing, shaking his head with a grin. "You're hopeless, but thanks for the tea." Kimimaro nodded, silent but pleased, as Naruto finished his breakfast, the weight of the day beginning to settle on his shoulders. Hokage Tower. Konoha. In the quiet of the Hokage's office, Naruto stood casually before the third Hokage, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, his ever-present grin slightly subdued. Hiruzen Sarutobi, the professor, sat behind his desk, attempting to project the stern authority of the village leader, though the warmth in his gaze betrayed him. "You've been avoiding me for quite some time, Naruto," Hiruzen began, his tone gruff but tinged with fatherly care. "Ah, well, you know how it is, Hokage-sama," Naruto said, his voice light but with a purposeful undertone. "Busy schedule, trees to climb, ramen to eat, world-shaking revelations to uncover. Never a dull moment." Hiruzen chuckled softly despite himself, shaking his head. You speak as though the weight of the world rests on your shoulders. Naruto leaned forward slightly, his grin fading into something sharper. Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. Isn't that the kind of ambiguity a shinobi thrives on? The Hokage leaned back, puffing his pipe, and studied the boy, or rather, the young man, standing before him. And what kind of shinobi do you thrive on being, Naruto? Naruto tilted his head, as though pondering the question deeply. You mean, who's my role model? He asked, an impish glint in his eye. Hiruzen nodded. I'd assume the fourth, that's who the kids your age tend to idolize. Naruto shrugged. Don't know enough about him to say, honestly. Seems like a great guy, but I don't exactly have a scrapbook of his highlights to flip through. If I had to pick a Hokage, I'd say the second. If I didn't have to pick a Hokage, though, I'd probably go with Madara Uchiha. The third Hokage froze mid-puff, his eyebrows rising in surprise. Madara? Madara. Naruto leaned against the desk casually, though his eyes gleamed with conviction. I mean, sure, he was a madman. But he understood people. The first Hokage? A legend, no doubt. But his way of building a village could only work with him at the helm. Hashirama was a Tenna, an emperor in all but name. But he was an emperor whose philosophy led to service above all, the only emperor, in fact, that maintained supplication to the daimyo of his birthland. His ideals carried weight because of who he was. Madara, though, he got that the best way to keep order wasn't through ideals but through understanding how people think. He's the kind of guy who'd have the whole world dancing to his tune if he hadn't gone completely bonkers. Hiruzen hummed thoughtfully, leaning forward. There is wisdom in what you say, though I disagree. Madara sought control through fear and dominance. The will of fire, the ideal of mutual respect and protection, is what has allowed this village to thrive. Maybe, Naruto admitted, his grin returning. Doesn't mean you're wrong, but ideals don't always pay the bills, do they? The Hokage regarded him for a long moment, then nodded. And why the second Hokage? My old sensei would surprise me if he knew someone like you held him in such high regard. Naruto's smile thinned, his eyes narrowing in thought. The second was complicated. People praise him for his systems, the Anbu, the departmental structures, all that. The logistics he created for the operation of his village were incorporated into many of the other great and minor villages. It's impressive, sure, but what makes him fascinating isn't his achievements, it's how he got there. Hiruzen raised an eyebrow. Explain. He talked about moving forward, about leaving behind the old ways of the shinobi world. But he didn't. Not really. He used those same archaic methods to get things done. Covert deals, brutal pragmatism, secrets within secrets. And he succeeded because he knew when to be a hypocrite. Naruto shrugged. A mighty hypocrite always lands upright. Hiruzen's lips twitched as he struggled to suppress a smile. Tobirama-sensei would have appreciated that description more than Naruto realizes. And his policies on the Anbu? The Hokage pressed, his curiosity piqued. Naruto paused, his usual flippancy giving way to a rare moment of sincerity. I think the leash is too tight. Hiruzen's expression grew serious. I was a child when the Anbu was something much different. It was unrefined, chaotic. Without guidance, a blade can strike wildly. And a dog can't hunt if you're choking it with the leash, Naruto countered, his gaze steady. I get the need for control. But there's a point where control becomes suffocation. The Hokage leaned back, studying the young man before him. For all his antics and whimsy, Naruto was sharp, perceptive, and steadfast. It reminded him, painfully so, of another blonde shinobi who had once stood in this office with big dreams and an unshakable will. Naruto smiled softly. You're trying to figure me out, Gigi. Don't worry, I'm still the knucklehead you've known since I was a kid. And yet, you're so much more, the Hokage murmured. Naruto's grin widened, but his eyes held something deeper, something unyielding. The air between them charged with the gravity of their conversation. Hiruzen's words hung in the room like the last flickers of a storm. Hiruzen took a moment to study Naruto, his youthful demeanor belying the weight of their conversation. The boy had always been a whirlwind of energy and mischief, but today there was something more deliberate about him, something sharper. The Hokage tapped his pipe against the ashtray, the embers glowing faintly in the dim light of his office. Naruto, he began, his voice lower, more serious. As you are aware, traditionally, those with your burden are automatically treated as members of the armed forces. Your existence alone has made you a part of Konoha's defense. Naruto leaned back slightly in his chair, a lopsided grin playing on his lips. Burden, huh? That's a diplomatic way to put it, Hokage-sama. Hiruzen's gaze softened slightly. You know what I mean. Naruto waved him off, his grin widening into something more like a smirk. It's not like there's a law requiring any secrecy, is there? Speak plainly, Hokage-sama. I am this village's Jinchuriki, every man, woman, and child in the country knows that. The Hokage's expression darkened, his pipe momentarily forgotten in his hand. His thoughts turned inward, disgruntled. If it were up to me, that fact would have been shrouded in the highest level of secrecy. A child shouldn't have to bear the weight of the world's scrutiny. Naruto leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his sharp blue eyes catching the Hokage's. So, let's get down to the specifics, shall we? Hiruzen's eyes narrowed, his voice taking on a subtle edge. And just why is it that you waited so long for this conversation, Naruto? Naruto shrugged nonchalantly, though there was a glimmer of something else in his expression, calculation, perhaps, or resolve. Timing is everything, Gigi. If you want a good bowl of ramen, you don't just throw the noodles in right away. You wait for the water to boil. Hiruzen leaned back, his gaze sharp and probing, but Naruto didn't flinch. The Hokage had seen countless shinobi wield deception like a blade, but with Naruto, it wasn't so much a mask as it was an entire wardrobe. Go on, then, Hiruzen said, his voice calm but firm. What is it you're after? Naruto tilted his head, his demeanor shifting slightly. I've been meaning to ask for something specific. The Hokage raised an eyebrow. Oh, and what might that be? A personal Anbu escort, Naruto said, his voice casual, though his gaze was anything but. Hiruzen's brow furrowed, his hands clasping together. A bold request. Naruto, refusing to break eye contact with the older shinobi, replied, but one with precedent. Do you have any idea what that entails? Mito Uzumaki had such personal guards, yes, but her status as Jinchuriki wasn't the sole reason. She was the reserve general of Hashirama-sama's forces and the heiress of the Uzumaki clan. Her station warranted it. Naruto laughed, his tone both playful and pointed. Ah, but Gigi, you're forgetting the little details. Nidōhime wasn't made the reserve general out of the goodness of Hashirama-sama's heart. That decision came straight from the daimyo's desk after she wrote to him herself. Hot-blooded Uzumaki and all that. Hiruzen leaned back, his face a mask of neutrality, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of surprise. Naruto pressed on, a glint in his eye. The missive that ordained her position didn't talk about her status as heiress. The daimyo said something about folly in leaving out one of the village's strongest resources, and he wasn't talking about her noble lineage. Besides, on the subject of heirs, I've been to the corners of the elemental nations, and I haven't found another Uzumaki who survived the purge. Something tells me Konoha hasn't either, though I bet you've been trying for decades. Hiruzen's face remained stoic, but his hesitation was palpable. Naruto's grin faded, his voice taking on a steelier edge. You already know this, though. The council granted me future headship of the Uzumaki clan and full ownership of the Uzumaki compound, didn't they? The Hokage's expression darkened for the first time in their conversation. How do you know that, Naruto? Naruto's smile returned, but it was sharper now, cutting. It's amazing the things that cross a secretary's desk every day. More work than one civilian woman can manage on her own, don't you think? Hiruzen's eyes narrowed as he studied Naruto intently. I did wonder why Hamura suddenly switched to an unscented shampoo after months of using something entirely different. Naruto chuckled, shrugging. In all fairness, I met the kid while we were chugging ramen. Hard to tell someone's natural scent under all that broth and chashu. The Hokage stared for a beat longer before Naruto spoke again, his tone deceptively light. Oh, and Hokage-sama? I know how your old student died, and who you investigated to get that information. The air in the room shifted. It wasn't just heavy, it was suffocating. The third Hokage's killing intent pressed down like an iron weight, the reminder that this man was the god of shinobi. Naruto felt the pressure, but instead of retreating, his eyes lit up with an almost manic excitement. This was the Hokage he respected. Hiruzen's voice was deadly calm. Are you threatening me, Naruto? Or this village? Naruto met his gaze directly, unflinching. I wouldn't dare presume, Hokage-sama. merely questioning the congruency with this information and the Lord of Fire's explicit ban on interaction with Attenda that was imposed on the village. But should I take this to mean you're challenging an Uzumaki? The tension hung for a moment longer before the Hokage exhaled heavily, the deadly aura dissipating. He slumped back into his chair, his shoulders dropping as he muttered in mock exasperation. With a flick of his wrist, Hiruzen hurled something across the room at a speed that could have seriously injured an unprepared shinobi. Naruto caught it easily, flipping it over in his hand. A konoha headband. Hiruzen glowered at him. You get 3. That's how many Mito-sama had. Naruto grinned, holding the headband up like a trophy. And they're standing orders? The Hokage tapped his pipe against the ashtray, thinking for a moment. Unless it is to the detriment of the village, your orders are absolute. But don't abuse this, Naruto. Naruto's grin widened. Wouldn't dream of it, Gigi. Hiruzen leaned forward, his tone suddenly commanding. Training ground 13. 7 tonight. We have a test to conduct. Naruto saluted with mock seriousness. You got it, Hokage-sama. As he turned to leave, Hiruzen watched him approach his office door, shaking his head. Mito-sama would have loved this one. As Naruto adjusted the newly gifted headband on his forehead, his sharp eyes darted to a shadowed corner of the room. His grin widened knowingly. Figure out amongst yourselves who is to become my fangs. A faint shuffle of movement betrayed the presence of someone unseen. Naruto paused, tapping his chin as if reconsidering. Actually, he continued, his tone suddenly more decisive, only 2 spots are available. Bring Inishishi-san and the 2 other chosen to the Uzumaki compound after tonight's test. Without waiting for acknowledgement, Naruto turned and left the office with his usual nonchalant swagger, the door clicking softly behind him. From the corner of the room, a figure melted out of the shadows, a masked Anbu with a hawk motif. He stood silently for a moment, his posture straight, yet his head tilted slightly in contemplation. Then, to the Hokage's surprise, the captain chuckled, a low, dry sound that carried a rare note of amusement. Hiruzen raised an eyebrow, his pipe forgotten in his hand. Something funny, Hawk? The Anbu captain shifted slightly, crossing his arms. He's bold, I'll give him that. Strong-arming the Hokage into assigning 3 elite operatives to him? Most would consider that political suicide. The Hokage's eyes narrowed, though there was a faint twitch at the corner of his lips. Boldness can quickly turn to recklessness. He's lucky I didn't assign him 3 genin instead. Hawk's deadpan response was immediate. You wouldn't have, and he knew it. He plays his hand well, even if he's brash. It's effective. Hiruzen leaned back in his chair, feigning irritation as he exhaled a puff of smoke. Don't encourage him. He's going to turn my hair grayer than it already is. The Anbu captain's mask tilted slightly, the faintest indication of a smile behind it. He would be proud. Hiruzen's sharp gaze snapped to Hawk, but he said nothing. Hawk's words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. The Hokage's grip on his pipe tightened slightly before he forced himself to relax, exhaling another cloud of smoke. I hope you're right, Hiruzen muttered, his voice softer, almost wistful. Hawk nodded once, then stepped back into the shadows of the room. His form seemed to ripple before disappearing entirely, his voice drifting back faintly as he melded into the darkness. Your thoughts on him aren't as hidden as you think, Hokage-sama. Left alone, Hiruzen sat in contemplative silence, staring at the door Naruto had exited through. The ghost of a fond smile tugged at his lips as he leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the portraits of the previous Hokage lining the walls. People are far too mean to the elderly these days, he muttered to himself, shaking his head slightly. But his smile grew warmer as he thought of the young Uzumaki, full of life and energy, always pushing boundaries. Far too mean, he repeated, chuckling softly before returning to his paperwork. Nami Nori Road, border of Wave Country. The clearing was a disaster. Broken branches and churned earth bore testament to the ferocity of the battle that had just taken place. The air still carried the lingering heaviness of chakra, though the thick mist that had enveloped them earlier was slowly dissipating, revealing the battered Team 7 and their unconscious sensei. Sasuke stood in the center of the mess, his sharp eyes darting over the scene as he tried to make sense of it. Kakashi lay nearby, his mask slightly askew, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The reveal of his Sharingan earlier still gnawed at the edges of Sasuke's thoughts, His sensei's power had been incredible. Yet, as his gaze flicked to Yakumo, unconscious a few feet away, her pale face damp with sweat from the strain of casting genjutsu against Zabuza Momochi, he shoved those thoughts aside. A rustling sound pulled his attention to Sakura, who was crouched next to Yakumo, her face pale and her hands trembling. Her breaths came too quickly, shallow and uneven, and she hadn't said a word since the Kiri Enbu had spirited Zabuza away. "This is a mess," Sasuke muttered under his breath, narrowing his eyes as he assessed their situation. Their two strongest team members were down, the bridge builder cowering behind a tree, and the mist still clung to the edges of the clearing. If anything happened now, they were vulnerable. He stalked towards Sakura, his voice cutting through the oppressive quiet. "Sakura." She didn't respond, her hands clenching and unclenching as she stared down at Yakumo. "Sakura," he barked, louder this time. She flinched, looking up at him with wide, tear-brimmed eyes. "I don't know if I can." "You don't have a choice," Sasuke interrupted harshly, his tone sharper than he intended. "We're exposed, and they could come back. We need to move now. You have to pull it together." Sakura's breath hitched, and for a moment, Sasuke thought she might start hyperventilating. He clenched his fists, his patience wearing thin. "Listen to me. Kakashi-sensei is out. Yakumo is out. It's just us. If you fall apart, none of us are making it out of here." That seemed to shake her. Sakura swallowed hard, her hands trembling less as she nodded shakily. "Oh okay," she whispered, glancing back at Yakumo. She knelt down, carefully lifting the unconscious girl over her shoulders with a grunt of effort. Sasuke turned to Kakashi, crouching down to lift his sensei. As he adjusted Kakashi's weight over his back, a thought struck him, sharp and unwelcome. I couldn't see that Kiri ninja move when she collected Momochi. The memory was vivid, and it bothered him more than he cared to admit. The supposed Anbu had appeared in an instant, retrieved Zabuza, and disappeared just as quickly, leaving behind only a faint ripple in the mist. Sasuke had prided himself on his ability to read movements, to predict and counter, but he hadn't even caught a blur. He glanced back at the clearing one last time before turning toward the bridge builder. "Stay close," he ordered tersely, motioning for Sakura to follow him. As they moved deeper into the forest, the mist finally began to dissipate, revealing more of the twisted remnants of the fight. Sasuke's jaw tightened as he scanned the area, his thoughts unsettled. "And I barely noticed that other ninja standing where the Kiri ninja appeared at." The presence had been fleeting, almost intangible, but it had been there, a subtle shift in the air, a barely perceptible figure lingering just out of sight. Sasuke shook his head, forcing himself to focus. They were still in enemy territory, and they wouldn't be safe until they reached the bridge builder's home. "Keep up," he said over his shoulder, his voice firm but steady. Despite the chaos, he felt a flicker of determination burn in his chest. They would make it through this, he would make sure of it. Training Ground 13, Konoha. The testing site for Naruto's aptitude evaluation was an open training field on the outskirts of Konoha, bordered by tall trees that rustled softly in the breeze. A few targets and sparring dummies stood at one edge of the clearing, while a sturdy observation platform had been set up on the opposite side, where the Hokage and his entourage waited. Naruto arrived, flanked by Kimimaro, who walked with his usual quiet grace, one sleeve swaying in the evening breeze. The pair made a striking image. Naruto with his golden hair catching fading sunlight, a small, confident smile playing on his lips, and Kimimaro, his white hair and stern demeanor a sharp contrast to his master's easy charm. The Hokage, clad in his ceremonial robes, stood alongside his son, Asuma Sarutobi, and Asuma's genin team. Choji Akamichi, Ino Yamanaka, and Shikamaru Nara. Asuma leaned casually against the platform railing, a lit cigarette dangling from his lips, while his team alternated between curious glances at Naruto and discreet whispers. Naruto offered a pleasant bow as he approached. "Hokage-sama, thank you for arranging this evaluation." He turned to Asuma, his tone light and whimsical. "And you must be the famed Asuma Sarutobi. It's an honor to meet a member of Lord Hitohito's 12 guardian ninja." Asuma blinked, clearly caught off guard by the recognition. He straightened slightly, scratching the back of his head. "Well, thanks. Didn't think I was a name anyone outside of shinobi bars knew." Naruto's smile widened, his blue eyes twinkling. Oh, come now. It wouldn't do not to know the ash barrel monkey. The nickname caused Asuma's cigarette to twitch, his mouth slightly agape in disbelief. Behind him, his genin team stared in confusion, glancing between their sensei and the grinning blonde. Ash barrel monkey? Shikamaru muttered under his breath. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Ino whispered. Choji shrugged. He doesn't look mad. I think it's good? Asuma finally sighed, shaking his head with a bemused smile. You're full of surprises, kid. Naruto turned his attention to Team 10, his gaze settling on each of them in turn. Though his expression was friendly, the sheer intensity of his attention made the genin shuffle nervously. Ino, despite her unease, found herself critically analyzing Naruto's hair. It's a shame he's a guy. That tone of blonde would be perfect on me. Shikamaru narrowed his eyes slightly, his analytical mind working. He doesn't seem like the moody prankster I remember dragging Anbu through the village in obstacle courses. But, how much of that guy is still in there? Choji, on the other hand, was far less concerned with Naruto's past and more focused on the future. He glanced at his teammates, then at Asuma, and finally at Naruto. Do you like barbecue? He asked suddenly. Naruto blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Barbecue? Sure, who doesn't? Choji beamed, looking to Asuma with a glint of mischief in his eyes. Great, maybe we can all get some after this. Sensei can pay. Asuma groaned, already feeling a phantom pang in the upper left thigh pocket where he kept his coin pouch. Choji? Naruto chuckled softly at the interaction, glancing at Kimimaro, who maintained his stoic silence but seemed faintly amused by the scene. I think I like this team, Hokage-sama, Naruto said, tilting his head toward the Sarutobis and their students. The Hokage gave a small, knowing smile, his gaze flicking briefly to Asuma, who was muttering something under his breath about gluttonous students and empty wallets. Well, Naruto, the Hokage said, his tone light yet carrying an undertone of anticipation. Let's see how you perform before we start planning barbecue outings, shall we? Naruto straightened, his expression sharpening into something serious and focused. Of course, Hokage-sama. Let's begin. The genin exchanged glances, suddenly reminded that this blonde-haired young man, whimsical though he seemed, was about to show them why he was standing before the Hokage for an aptitude test. The Hokage's voice cut through the murmuring breeze, carrying an air of authority that demanded focus. Naruto, for your aptitude test, you will spar against members of Team 10. Naruto's gaze immediately darted to Asuma, his expression unreadable but charged with a sharp intensity that caused the Hokage's son to stiffen. Asuma's cigarette faltered, nearly slipping from his lips. The Hokage raised a brow at the interaction, then clarified, not Asuma. His students will be your opponents. Naruto tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing in askance at the Hokage. The genin of Team 10 exchanged confused glances, their unease growing as they struggled to read the enigmatic blonde. After a moment's pause, Naruto sighed, his shoulders relaxing, and his expression shifted back to his usual whimsical demeanor. Ah, I see, Naruto said with a faint smile. Without further comment, he began walking across the clearing toward a large tree stump. What are you doing? Choji asked, breaking the silence as Naruto approached the stump and raised a hand to its rough surface. Naruto glanced over his shoulder. When I remove my hand from this stump, you three can start whenever you like. The statement hung in the air, and even Asuma's eyes widened slightly. Confident, huh? I know he's supposed to be good, but this is bordering on arrogance, Asuma thought, glancing at his father. Yet the Hokage made no move to intervene, his calm gaze fixed on the unfolding scene. Ino's eyes narrowed. Are you kidding me? Don't just stand there gawking, you two. She barked at her teammates, dropping into a ready stance. I'm not letting some blonde, whiskered boy beat the Ino Shika-cho. As Ino's voice echoed across the clearing, Naruto turned back to face them, his expression contemplative. He studied the three genin as they shifted into readiness, his mind diving into a deep analysis of their formation. The Ino Shika-cho, he mused, a symbiotic formation born of three clans whose histories are as intertwined as their jutsu. His thoughts drifted back to the near-clan war era, a turbulent time when alliances and betrayals were commonplace among shinobi factions. The Akamichi, Yamanaka, and Nara clans had forged their bond during this period, their union initially one of necessity rather than friendship. The Akamichi's raw strength and resilience, the Yamanaka's precision in intelligence and espionage, and the Nara's unparalleled strategic acumen complemented each other perfectly. Their unity had drawn the attention of the Senju during the early days of Konoha's founding, and it was Hashirama himself who had brokered the official pact that solidified their alliance. Over time, what began as a pragmatic partnership evolved into an unshakable bond of kinship. The Naras, in particular, hold an elevated status, Naruto thought, his eyes flickering to Shikamaru. A great clan of Konoha, integral not only to the Ino-Shika-Cho formation but to the very governance of the village. Their intelligence and pragmatism are legendary. Naruto's gaze shifted to Ino. The Yamanaka, masters of the mind, often underestimated because their techniques are subtle. But subtlety is their strength. A whisper of influence can change the tide of a battle. Finally, his eyes rested on Choji. And the Akamichi, raw power wrapped in a kind heart. The greatest danger they present is their unpredictability. That kindness hides a fierce will to protect. Naruto smiled faintly as he finished his thoughts. The trio before him represented centuries of refinement in a formation designed to cover weaknesses and amplify strengths. This wasn't a simple spar, it was a battle against tradition and history itself. "Anytime you're ready," he called out, his voice steady and confident. The clearing fell silent as Team 10 prepared themselves, their earlier hesitation replaced by a growing determination. This was no longer just a test for Naruto, it was a challenge to the legacy they had inherited. As if a bell had gone off, the three genin burst into action, sprinting at the young Uzumaki. Naruto's movements were fluid and unhurried, his body twisting and turning with an ease that seemed almost lazy. Yet no matter how fast Ino struck or how suddenly Choji barreled toward him, he always seemed to slip away at the last possible moment. Ino lunged, kunai in hand, aiming for a quick slash across Naruto's arm. He leaned back just enough to let the blade pass harmlessly, his expression almost apologetic. "Close," he said with a grin, "but not quite. Hold still, you jerk." Ino snapped, her frustration bubbling over. Before she could recover, Choji came rolling in from the side in his Nakuden Sensha, human bullet tank, technique, kicking up dirt and leaves as he surged forward like an unstoppable force. Naruto sidestepped at the last second, planting a hand on Choji's spinning mass and vaulting over him in an effortless flip. "Whoa there, big guy. You almost had me," he teased, landing lightly on the balls of his feet. "Choji, stay on him," Shikamaru shouted, his shadow racing across the ground toward Naruto. The black tendrils of Shikamaru's Kagemane no Jutsu, shadow imitation technique, snaked forward, weaving through the terrain in a deceptively slow crawl. Naruto glanced down, the corner of his mouth twitching in amusement. Ah, the Nara clan's famous shadows. Always a fan favorite. He hopped backward, his movements timed perfectly to stay just out of reach of the encroaching shadow. But Shikamaru wasn't done. He adjusted the angle, steering the shadow toward Naruto's flank while Choji came back around for another charge. Naruto's eyes flicked between the two, his smile widening. "Oh, this is getting interesting." Choji bore down on him, the ground trembling under his momentum. Shikamaru's shadow curved, tightening its net. At the last possible moment, Naruto dropped into a low crouch and launched himself straight up, flipping high into the air. Choji's rolling form plowed into the shadow's path, momentarily breaking Shikamaru's line of sight and halting his technique. From his aerial vantage, Naruto twisted midair, his gaze sharp as he watched the formation adjust. He landed softly behind Ino, startling her as she whirled around. "Don't turn your back on me," she snapped, launching a flurry of kunai. Naruto tilted his body, letting the blades zip past him, each one missing by the narrowest of margins. His grin never faltered. "Nice form, Yamanaka-heim. But you've got to aim where I'm going to be, not where I am." "Arg, he's mocking us," Ino yelled, her frustration boiling over. "Focus, Ino," Shikamaru called, his voice steady despite the chaos. Naruto shifted his attention to Shikamaru, who was already recalibrating his strategy. The shadow started moving again, this time creeping toward Naruto's feet in an unassuming arc. At the same time, Choji's rolling form came at him from another angle, faster and more coordinated. Naruto pretended to stumble, letting Choji's charge come dangerously close. At the last second, he planted a foot on Choji's spinning mass and used the momentum to vault over the shadow entirely. Almost had me that time. Naruto called out as he landed lightly on the stump he had originally marked as the starting point. The three genin regrouped, their breath heavy but their eyes determined. Ino's fists tightened. I've had enough of this. Formation D. Naruto's smile faded, his stance shifting subtly. Finally, he murmured, his voice low, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Naruto repositioned his footing, his weight centered and his legs braced as if anticipating an oncoming storm. He let his fingers curl at his sides, exhaling slowly through his nose as Ino barked out her orders. Shikamaru, cover me. Choji, pressure from the side. Ino's voice was sharp and commanding, her frustrations channeled into determination. The Ino-Shika-Cho formation snapped into action. Shikamaru's shadow darted forward with renewed purpose, moving faster and more deliberately, while Choji launched himself at Naruto from the right in his Nakuden Sensha. Ino dashed straight at Naruto, her kunai gleaming as the sunlight caught its edge. Naruto's smile returned, sharper now, his eyes flicking between his opponents. "Oh, this is going to be fun," he muttered. He didn't dodge immediately. Instead, he waited, letting them close the gap. Shikamaru's shadow raced along the ground, forcing him to shift his footing slightly to avoid getting caught. Choji barreled in from the side, forcing him to step back. And that's when Ino struck. She leapt, her kunai slicing downward in a precise arc aimed for Naruto's shoulder. Naruto tilted his head just enough to let the blade pass, grabbing her wrist mid-swing and redirecting her momentum. She stumbled but didn't fall, twisting out of his grip with surprising agility. "Nice," Naruto said with a nod. Ino didn't respond, her focus razor-sharp as she signaled to her teammates with a quick hand gesture. Shikamaru's shadow lunged again, this time with a feint that forced Naruto to step into Choji's path. Choji, seizing the opportunity, swerved mid-roll, his massive form bearing down on Naruto with devastating speed. Naruto ducked low, planting his hands on the ground and spinning his legs out in a sweeping motion. His kick struck Choji's side with just enough force to throw off his trajectory, sending him careening into a nearby tree with a loud thud. Before Naruto could recover, Shikamaru's shadow was on him again. He flipped backward, narrowly avoiding its grasp, but this time his landing was less graceful, his foot slipped slightly on the loose dirt. Ino didn't miss her chance. Shintenshin no Jutsu. Naruto felt the jolt immediately, a sudden pull at his consciousness as Ino's technique took hold. For a moment, everything was dark. Naruto found himself standing in a void, an endless expanse of pitch-black silence. He blinked, looking around, his senses heightened. "So this is what it's like in here," he murmured, his voice echoing strangely. He felt her presence before he saw her. Ino appeared, or at least a spectral version of her, standing several feet away with a triumphant smirk. "Got you," she said, crossing her arms. Naruto's grin widened. "Are you sure about that?" Ino's smirk faltered. The void around her began to ripple, a strange pressure building in the air. She glanced around, her confidence wavering as the darkness started to twist and warp. What is this?" she whispered. Naruto stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. "It's time for you to leave." The void shattered like glass, and Ino's consciousness was yanked back to her own body. Naruto's eyes snapped open as Ino crumpled to the ground, her unconscious body landing mere inches from Shikamaru, who was in the middle of manipulating his shadow technique. Shikamaru froze, his eyes darting toward Ino in alarm. "Ino," he called out, but before he could process her sudden collapse, Naruto's hands blurred through a series of seals. Futon. Kei's no ya. A sharp, whistling sound filled the air as a bullet of wind surged toward Shikamaru. He barely had time to react, instinct taking over as he abandoned his jutsu and lunged for Ino. Wrapping his arms around her limp form, he pushed off the ground in a desperate leap to avoid the oncoming wind attack. As he twisted midair, Shikamaru's ears caught a faint hissing sound from behind him, a sound that sent a chill down his spine. His sharp mind pieced it together instantly, an explosive tag. Damn it! With Ino secure in his arms, he shifted his trajectory, aiming for the edge of the tree line to avoid the presumed explosion. The moment he landed, he risked a glance back to where he had been moments ago. But instead of the detonation he had expected, there was nothing. No explosion. No smoke. Genjutsu? Shikamaru muttered under his breath, cursing himself for falling into the trap. Before he could fully assess the situation, he lifted his head to locate Naruto. What he saw instead was Choji barreling toward Naruto in his Nakuden Sensha, the massive ball of chakra-infused momentum careening straight for him. Shikamaru felt a flicker of hope. If Choji connects, that's it. The impact was deafening, but as the water splashed outward, soaking the clearing, it became clear that the Naruto Choji had struck was not the real one. Instead, it was a water clone, and Choji's powerful charge had unwittingly provided the real Naruto with enough water to execute his next move. Shikamaru's stomach sank as he saw Choji now thrashing inside a swirling orb of water, the unmistakable water prison jutsu. Troublesome, Shikamaru muttered, already knowing what was coming. Before he could react, a cold blade pressed lightly against his throat. His muscles tensed as Naruto's voice came from behind him, calm and composed. "So, does your team want to continue?" Shikamaru turned his head slightly, just enough to confirm that the real Naruto had emerged from the shadow of the tree he had landed near. He glanced toward Choji, whose struggles in the water prison had turned into an almost comical attempt at a breaststroke without actually breathing. Then to Ino, still unconscious in his arms. Shikamaru sighed heavily, dropping Ino to the ground with a thud and raising his hands in surrender. "Troublesome," he repeated. The jolt from hitting the ground jolted Ino awake. She yelped and looked around in confusion. "What the hell happened?" she demanded, her gaze snapping from Shikamaru to the restrained Choji, and then to Naruto, who still held the blade at Shikamaru's throat with an air of casual dominance. Naruto smiled, pulling the blade back and letting Shikamaru relax. "You tell me," he said, his tone light, but his eyes sparkling with a hint of mischief. End of Chapter 3. Spoilers. The air in the partially crumbled office was thick with smoke and tension, the faint acrid scent of burning wood and stone wafting in from the shattered windows. Through the jagged gaps in the Mizukage's once stately office, the smoldering remains of Kirigakure were visible, cloaked in a haze that blurred the line between sky and ruin. Naruto sat rigid in the chair opposite Maid Terumi, his fists clenched atop his knees as he fixed her with a heated glare. Across from him, the fifth Mizukage leaned back in her chair, one leg crossed elegantly over the other, her chin propped delicately on her hand. Her eyes sparkled with mirth, her lips curved into a grin that was equal parts teasing and predatory. "No," Naruto growled, his voice low and firm. "Yes," Mei responded, her voice a purr of amusement, the single syllable dripping with playful delight. "No," he repeated, louder this time, his glare narrowing into daggers. "Yes," she sang, drawing the word out as if savoring it, her grin widening. "No," Naruto nearly shouted, leaning forward, his tone laced with frustration. "Yes, Tilda," Maid trilled, her lilting tone now turning the word into a melody, her grin never faltering. The room fell silent for a beat, save for the distant crackle of fires and the groan of Kirigakure's broken infrastructure. Mei let the quiet stretch just long enough for her victory to sink in, then suddenly whooped in triumph, clapping her hands together like a child who had just won a game. Naruto's glare reignited, his lips pressing into a thin line before he turned his head sharply away from her, muttering just loud enough for his words to reach her ears. "You're still a magma-spewing monster in my mind. This doesn't change anything." Maid tilted her head, her grin softening but not fading as she replied with a sweet, almost sing-song tone. "Yes it does, Koi. It changes quite a bit." Naruto tensed at the endearment, his ears burning as he steadfastly refused to look at her again. Maid chuckled softly, the sound somehow managing to be both amused and dangerous, like lava bubbling just beneath the surface. Through the smoke-streaked light of the ruined office, her gaze remained fixed on him, savoring the subtle cracks in his usual composure. That's all for now. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments.